Margaret Hollis stood in the middle of Rosalie Ashcroft's kitchen and said it loud enough for the children to hear. "No decent man is going to chain himself to another man's leavings, Rosalie. 3 kids? You'll be begging for scraps by winter." She didn't even lower her voice. She wanted the children to hear it. That was the kind of woman Margaret Hollis was. Rosalie's hands went still on the dishcloth. 8-year-old Clara had stopped breathing in the doorway. 5-year-old Thomas had his fists balled at his sides. And little May, barely 3, was holding her rag doll so tightly the seams were starting to split. Rosalie looked at her sister-in-law, the only family she had left in the world, and she thought, this is what we are to people. Leavings. She thought it. She didn't say it. She was too tired to say it. If you've ever been told you were too much, too complicated, too broken, too burdened for someone to love, this story is for you. Subscribe and follow this all the way to the end, because what happens next on this Montana frontier will stay with you long after the final scene. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The letter from Montana arrived on a Tuesday, which Rosalie would later think was appropriate because nothing important ever happened on a Tuesday. It was too ordinary a day for life to pivot on, and yet there it was, a single page, written in a careful, unhurried hand that told her very little about the man who'd written it, and everything about the kind of person he was trying to be. I have a working cattle ranch outside of Mill Haven, Montana. 640 acres, a decent house, 2 hired hands who don't give me trouble. I am 34 years old, I don't drink, I have not been married before. I am not looking for a housekeeper or a woman to fill a role. I am looking for a family. If you have children, that is not a complication. That is the point. Silas Granger. She read it 3 times, standing at the kitchen table while May tugged at the hem of her dress and Thomas argued with Clara in the next room about something involving a tin soldier and a missing boot. She read it a 4th time sitting down. She read it a 5th time that night after all 3 children were asleep, with the oil lamp burning low and the weight of every decision she'd made in the last 2 years pressing down on her chest like a stone. Her husband Daniel had been dead for 14 months. Pneumonia, the doctor had said, as if a single word could explain how a man who'd been laughing at breakfast could be gone by the following Thursday. He'd left her a house with a leaky roof, a small savings that lasted 8 months, and 3 children who still sometimes called for him in the night without knowing they were doing it. Clara did it with a kind of angry grief that a girl her age had no business carrying. Thomas did it by going very quiet and very still, which was somehow worse. May was too young to understand absence, so she understood it the only way she could. She stopped letting go of things. The rag doll, for instance. Daniel had given it to her a week before he got sick. It was a rough-made thing, cotton-stuffed, with button eyes that didn't quite match. May treated it like it was made of something sacred. Rosalie's savings ran out in October. By November, she'd taken in washing. By December, she was doing alterations for 3 different households and still coming up short on the rent. Margaret Hollis, Daniel's older sister, a woman who wore her opinions like a second skin and never thought to take them off indoors, had been nudging her toward the matrimonial notices in the back of the newspapers since September. "I'm not saying you have to like whoever you find," Margaret had said. "I'm saying you have a practical problem, and this is a practical solution." Rosalie had resisted it the way she resisted most things that felt like defeat. She was not a woman who gave up easily, but she was also not a woman who could watch her children go hungry and call it pride. She wrote back to 12 men over 6 weeks. 4 never replied. 3 replied and then stopped when she mentioned the children. 2 were honest enough to say outright that they'd been hoping for a woman without encumbrances. 1 wrote back something that made her skin crawl and which she burned immediately. 1 seemed promising until his second letter, which made clear he expected Clara and Thomas to work the fields from dawn and would put May in the care of a neighbor during the days. That left Silas Granger. She wrote to him cautiously. She told him the truth. All of it, including the parts she was ashamed of. She told him Daniel had died 14 months ago. She told him Clara was 8 and difficult and protective and sometimes said things that could strip paint. She told him Thomas was 5 and gentle and had a stutter that came and went depending on how safe he felt. She told him May was 3 and hadn't spoken more than a handful of words since Daniel died, and the doctors in town had no explanation for it except to suggest she might grow out of it. She told him she was not a woman who would pretend to be something she wasn't. She told him she had no dowry, no family money, no property. She told him the only things she was bringing to Montana were 3 children who'd been through too much and a suitcase that had seen better days. She sent the letter and then spent a week certain she'd made an error in judgment, because what man in his right mind would read that letter and write back? Silas Granger wrote back in 4 days. I appreciate you telling me the truth. Most people don't. Clara sounds like someone who learned early that the world doesn't protect you if you don't protect yourself. Thomas's stutter doesn't concern me. My youngest brother had one, and he grew out of it around 7. May will talk when she's ready. Or she won't. Either way, the suitcase doesn't matter. Come in April when the passes are clear. I'll have the east room ready for the girls and the small room off the kitchen for Thomas. SG. She read that letter so many times the paper went soft at the folds. She did not let herself hope. She was 39 years old. She'd written 29 in her correspondence because Margaret had told her to, and the dishonesty had sat in her stomach like a meal gone bad ever since. She was not beautiful in the way that forgave things, not charming in the way that smoothed over awkward silences. She was tired in a way that showed in her face and her hands, and the way she sometimes paused in the middle of a task and stared at nothing for just a moment too long. She had been carrying things for a long time, and carrying shows. But she had 3 children who needed a roof and a future, and Silas Granger had said, come. So she went. The train from Kansas City to Mill Haven, Montana took 3 days. Clara sat with her arms crossed, and her jaw set for most of it, staring out the window with the focused expression of someone memorizing an escape route. Thomas pressed his nose to the glass every time they passed through open country and said horses under his breath each time he spotted a herd, which happened often enough that Rosalie lost count. May sat in Rosalie's lap and held the rag doll and watched everything with large, serious eyes and said nothing. Rosalie did not sleep well on the train. She lay in the narrow berth on the second night listening to May's soft breathing and Thomas's occasional sleep mumbling and Clara's rigid, wakeful silence, and she thought about all the ways this could go wrong. She had a talent for that kind of thinking. She could map the failure of a thing before it had even had a chance to begin. She thought, he will see us at the station and his face will change. She thought, he will have expected someone younger, prettier, less complicated. She thought, he will be polite about it, and that will be the worst kind. She thought all of these things, and then she thought about Margaret Hollis, standing in her kitchen telling her children they were leavings. And she pressed her face briefly into May's hair and decided that whatever happened in Montana, it could not be worse than staying. The station at Mill Haven was smaller than she'd expected. A single platform, a painted wooden sign, half a dozen people moving in different directions with the particular purposefulness of people who didn't have time to stand around watching trains arrive. Rosalie stepped down with May on her hip and her suitcase in her other hand and turned to make sure Clara and Thomas were behind her. And when she turned back around, there was a man standing at a slight distance from the crowd. She knew it was him. She didn't know how she knew. He hadn't described himself beyond tall, dark hair. We'll be wearing a hat because it's Montana, and everyone wears a hat. But she knew. He was watching them with an expression that wasn't what she'd braced for. He wasn't assessing them. He wasn't calculating. He was just looking, the way you look at something you'd been trying to picture for a long time, and now you finally could. I was taller than she'd imagined, lean in the way of men who worked with their bodies. His hat was dark and worn and pushed back slightly, and he held it in his hands when he walked toward them, which she noticed because it was a courteous thing to do, and she hadn't been expecting courtesy. Mrs. Ashcroft, he said. Not a question. Mr. Granger, she said. He looked at the children. Clara looked back at him with flat, unimpressed eyes that she'd been practicing since approximately birth. Thomas had gone still the way he did when he was deciding something. May turned her face into Rosalie's neck and held her doll tighter. Something moved across Silas Granger's face. Not disappointment, not the flinch she'd been waiting for. Something that looked improbably like recognition. Long trip? He asked. 3 days, Rosalie said. Hungry? Clara said before Rosalie could answer. We're not charity cases. Silas looked at Clara with the same level of attention he'd given the rest of them and said, I know, I'm just asking if you're hungry. It's a long drive to the ranch. Clara held his gaze for 4 full seconds. Then she said, Thomas didn't eat much on the train. He gets nervous. Thomas's ears went red. Clara, it's true. I'm not nervous anymore. You stuttered just now. That's because you said, I have food in the wagon, Silas said simply, not cutting them off exactly, but offering them somewhere else to land. Nothing fancy, bread, some cold chicken, apples. Help yourselves when we load up. Thomas looked at him sideways. You brought apples? I figured kids like apples. I like apples, Thomas said, with the careful neutrality of someone not ready to commit to liking the person who'd brought them. Good, Silas said. He picked up Rosalie's suitcase without making a thing of it and started toward the wagon. Rosalie stood still for just a moment, watching him go, waiting for the catch. There was always a catch. Every letter had been too reasonable, too decent, too free of the red flags she'd trained herself to look for. This man was either exactly what he presented himself to be, which she had no framework for believing, or he was something else entirely, which she was still waiting to discover. Clara appeared at her elbow. He didn't look at us like we were a problem, Clara said. No, Rosalie said. He didn't. That's either good or it means he doesn't see things clearly. Maybe, Rosalie said. Clara chewed her lip. I'm keeping both options open. That's my girl, Rosalie said, and shifted May to her other hip and followed Silas Granger to the wagon. The drive to the ranch took the better part of 2 hours on roads that were more suggestion than fact, through country so big and open it made Rosalie feel simultaneously small and strangely free. Thomas ate an apple and then another one and fell asleep against Clara's shoulder. May stayed awake and watched the landscape go by without blinking, the way she watched most things, total attention, no commentary. Clara sat straight-backed and alert and said nothing. Silas drove. He didn't fill the silence with talk, which Rosalie noticed and filed away. She'd spent the last year of her marriage and all 14 months since surrounded by people who filled silences with advice and opinions and things she hadn't asked for. The quiet from this man felt different, not empty, just patient. They were maybe 40 minutes from the ranch when she made herself say the thing she'd been carrying since the train. I need to tell you something. He didn't tense. He didn't glance at her sharply. He just said, all right. I'm not 29, she said. I'm 39. My sister-in-law told me to write 29 in my letters because she said a man looking for a wife wouldn't be interested in a woman my age with 3 children, and I listened to her, and I shouldn't have, and I'm sorry. The wagon went over a rut. Thomas made a small sound in his sleep and didn't wake. Silas watched the road. I figured, he said. She felt the air go out of her. You figured. You wrote about 14 months of managing alone after your husband died, taking in washing, making decisions for 3 kids. You don't carry that kind of weight at 29. He was quiet for a moment. Doesn't change anything. It should, she said, because she couldn't help it. Most men would... I know what most men would do, he said, still watching the road. I'm not most men. I don't mean that like it's something to brag about. I just mean, I wrote those letters to you, not to a 29-year-old, to whoever wrote back to me honestly about her children and her situation, and the fact that she had nothing to offer except the truth. He paused. That's not nothing. That's actually pretty rare. Rosalie looked at her hands in her lap. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she was not about to start in the front seat of a wagon in Montana with her children 20 inches away. But something in her chest moved in a way it hadn't moved in a very long time, like a locked door shifting in its frame. She did not trust it. She noted it, the way you note the weather, and she put it aside. They came over a low rise, and the ranch appeared below them in the late afternoon light. A solid house, white paint worn to the color of old bone, a red barn, fencing that went further than she could see, and in the distance a line of cattle moving slow and dark against the grass. Clara leaned forward. She didn't say anything, but she leaned forward, and for just a moment the flat, defended expression dropped off her face, and she was just a girl looking at a place, wondering if it could possibly be anything. Rosalie saw it. Silas, she realized a second later, saw it too, because he said, quietly, not making a big thing of it, the east pasture has a creek. There's a good climbing tree about a quarter-mile down. Clara sat back and reassembled her expression. I don't climb trees, she said. You don't have to, he said. Thomas woke up as they pulled into the yard, looked around and said, before anyone could stop him, Is this really going to be our home? The word home landed in the space between all of them. Rosalie's throat did something inconvenient. Silas set the brake on the wagon and climbed down and came around to help May, who surprised everyone, including herself, by releasing one arm from around her doll and letting him lift her down. He was careful with her. He set her on her feet and crouched to her level and said, "You want to see the horses before we go inside?" May looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at her doll. Then she looked back at him and gave a single nod. "All right," he said. He stood and looked at Rosalie. "Is that okay?" She was not prepared for that question. Daniel had been a good man, a kind man, but the decisions about the children had always been made around her, or for her, or simply made. No one had asked her, "Is that okay?" in a very long time. "Yes," she said. "That's fine." She watched Silas Granger walk her silent, walled-off, grief-heavy 3-year-old toward the fence line, moving slowly enough that May could keep up, saying something low that Rosalie couldn't catch from the distance. Clara appeared beside her again. "He's good with her," Clara said, grudgingly. "Yes. That could just be first-day behavior." "It could be. People are always better on the first day." Rosalie looked at her oldest child, this fierce, exhausted 8-year-old soldier who'd been protecting her family with every breath she took since the night her father died. And she thought, she's not wrong. She's learned everything she knows about trust from watching it fail. "You're right," Rosalie said. "So we watch. We don't decide today." Clara seemed satisfied with that. "Okay." "Okay," Rosalie echoed. And she watched May reach through the fence and touch the nose of a dark horse that bent down to meet her. And she watched Silas Granger stand just to the side and say nothing, just let it happen. And she thought, please let this be real. She did not say that out loud. She hadn't allowed herself to say the word please about anything in a very long time. It cost too much. It meant you needed something, and needing things was a vulnerability she couldn't afford. But she thought it. She stood in the yard of a stranger's ranch in Montana with the late light going gold and her broken, imperfect, furiously loved children scattered around her, and she thought please so hard it was almost like a sound. Inside the house, she would find that the east room had 2 beds. Not 1, 2, which meant he'd thought about which children needed to share space and which needed their own. The small room off the kitchen had a window with a view of the corral, and beside the bed there was a small wooden crate turned on its side that was clearly meant to be a shelf, and on it someone had placed a wooden carved horse, rough-made but recognizable. Thomas found it that first evening. He stood in the doorway of his new room and looked at the carved horse and looked at Silas, who was passing in the hall and hadn't said anything about it, and said, with his stutter entirely absent for once, "Did you make that?" Silas paused. "Started it a while back, finished it last week." "For me?" "Well," Silas said, "I didn't know you yet, but I figured whoever was coming would like horses, since I wrote that I have them, and you'd have to be a particular kind of person not to like horses." Thomas turned back to look at the carving. "It looks like the dark one outside," he said. "That's Midnight," Silas said. "He's the most patient one. Good horse to learn on, if you want to." Thomas wrapped both hands around the carving and held it carefully and said, "Yeah, I want to." That was the moment, not any of the other moments. Not the apple, not the wagon, not the creek tree. This one. Thomas, holding a carved horse in a room made for him by a man who'd made it before he even knew the boy's name. Rosalie was standing in the hall behind Silas, and she saw it, and she pressed one hand flat against the doorframe and held on, because something was cracking open inside her chest, and she didn't quite know what to do about that. It felt like the first real breath she'd taken in 14 months. It also terrified her completely, because this was the thing she was afraid of. Not failure. She knew how to survive failure. She'd been surviving it for over a year. What she didn't know how to survive was hope. Hope was the dangerous thing. Hope was the thing that cost you everything when it turned out to be wrong. She went to bed that first night on a narrow mattress in a room that smelled like cedar and old wood in Montana winter, and she stared at the ceiling in the dark, and she told herself, with great firmness and not a great deal of success, to keep her distance. She was not going to let herself need this. She was not going to let her children need this. She was going to keep one foot out the door. Emotionally, just in case. Just until she knew for certain. She told herself that. The problem was that the house was warm. The problem was that she could hear Thomas's soft breathing down the hall, and it sounded different than it had in Kansas City, less held, somehow, less braced. The problem was that May had fallen asleep with her rag doll tucked under one arm and Silas Granger's horse under the other, and she'd allowed it to happen without protest, which was the first time in 14 months May had accepted anything new into the sacred circle of things she would hold. The problem was that Silas Granger had said goodnight to all four of them before he went to his room with the same simple, unhurried tone he used for everything, and none of it had felt like a performance. The problem was that it felt, very quietly, like the beginning of something. And Rosalie Ashcroft was 39 years old, and she'd buried a husband and raised 3 children through the worst year of her life, and she did not believe in beginnings anymore, except that here was one, right in front of her, unmistakably. She closed her eyes. Don't, she thought. But the house was warm, and the night was quiet, and she was so tired of keeping her foot at the door. The second morning came with frost on the windows and the smell of coffee already in the air before Rosalie had her boots on. She lay still for a moment, listening. There was sound in this house, actual sound, not the particular silence of a place where grief had settled in and stopped the clocks. She could hear the stove. She could hear something outside, probably the hired hands, probably the horses. She could hear faintly Thomas's voice down the hall, talking to someone, and then a lower voice answering. She was on her feet and moving before she'd consciously decided to, which was a reflex left over from 14 months of being the only adult in a house with 3 children. The kind of reflex that didn't care whether you were in Kansas City or Montana or the surface of the moon. She stopped in the kitchen doorway. Thomas was sitting at the table with a mug of warm milk in front of him and a piece of bread with butter that he'd eaten most of one side of. And he was talking to Silas Granger, who was standing at the stove not looking at Thomas, which Rosalie recognized immediately as a deliberate choice, the way you look away from a shy animal so it doesn't bolt. Thomas was explaining, in careful detail, the difference between 2 types of tin soldiers he'd had, one of which had been lost in the move and one of which was somewhere in his bag, and he was going to find it later. He was not stuttering. He was talking the way he talked when he felt safe, which was a version of Thomas that Rosalie had been getting less and less of since Daniel died. Silas said, without turning around, "What color was the one you lost?" "Blue," Thomas said. "He was a sea cavalry one, with the sword. I might know where to get another one. Town has a general store." Thomas went quiet for a moment. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't. My mom says we shouldn't ask for things." Silas finally turned from the stove and set a plate down at the table and said simply, "I didn't hear you ask for anything. I made an observation." He looked up then and saw Rosalie in the doorway and said, "Coffee's made," in the same tone he'd used for everything else. No drama, no look of someone expecting to be thanked. Rosalie came into the kitchen and poured herself a cup and stood at the counter and watched her son eat his breakfast and talk about tin soldiers with a man he'd known for less than 24 hours. And she felt the careful things she'd built around herself overnight develop a small, inconvenient crack. Clara came in 20 minutes later with her hair still half loose and her expression already set for the day, which meant it was set somewhere between skeptical and barely tolerant. She sat down, ate without being asked, said thank you for the food in a tone that was technically polite and personally distant, and then said to Rosalie, "I want to see the creek." "After breakfast," Rosalie said. "That is after breakfast." "After your breakfast." Clara looked down at her plate, which she'd barely touched. She picked up her fork with the energy of someone making an enormous concession and ate 3 bites of egg. "There's a path from the back of the barn," Silas said. "Easy to find. Just follow the fence line east." Clara didn't look at him. "I wasn't asking for directions." "You weren't," he said. "I was just telling you in case you wanted them." Clara ate another bite of egg. Rosalie watched this exchange the way she watched most things between her children and Silas, with the particular tension of someone waiting for the moment when patience ran out. It hadn't run out yet. She kept expecting it to. May came in last, because May always came in last, carrying her rag doll and the small carved horse, one in each hand, as if she'd conducted an executive decision overnight about what mattered and refused to choose. She climbed into this chair next to Thomas, set both items carefully on the table in front of her, and looked at Silas with the unblinking, unreadable focus that most adults found unsettling. Silas looked back at her with the same level steadiness and said, "Good morning." May looked at her doll, then at the carved horse, then back at Silas. Then she picked up the horse and held it out toward him. The kitchen went quiet in a way that had weight to it. Rosalie didn't breathe. Silas crossed to the table, crouched to May's level, and looked at the horse she was holding out. He didn't take it. He just looked at it, and then he said very quietly, "You want to show me?" May turned the horse so it faced him. One of the carved ears had a slight chip in it that Rosalie hadn't noticed before, a small imperfection where the wood had split wrong. Yeah, Silas said, like he was seeing it too. I made that one a little crooked, didn't have the right tool for the ear. He paused. He's still a good horse, though. May turned the horse back toward herself and looked at the chipped ear with the same seriousness she gave everything. Then she put it back beside her doll and picked up her fork. Thomas let out a breath. Clara, who had been watching from behind her carefully maintained expression, looked down at her plate quickly. Rosalie put her coffee cup down on the counter because her hands weren't entirely steady. This was the problem with Silas Granger. He kept doing things like that. Small things, unannounced things, things that didn't ask for recognition or gratitude. He was not performing goodness. He just kept being it, quietly, in the corners of ordinary moments. And it was far more dangerous than she'd anticipated. She'd been prepared for a man who was kind in the big, visible ways. She hadn't been prepared for this. The first week was a process of learning the shape of each other, and it was not without friction. Clara refused to let Silas fix the loose heel on her shoe, even though she was visibly walking lopsidedly and had to know he'd noticed. She took the shoe off in the evening and sat at the kitchen table and tried to hammer the heel back herself with a rock she'd found outside, which didn't work, and then sat in hostile silence for a while and then went to bed. The next morning, the shoe was on the kitchen table with the heel properly fixed and a small note that just said, S. Clara looked at it for a long time. She put the shoe on. She didn't say anything about it. Thomas asked on day 3 if he could watch Silas and the hired hands, whose names were Pete and Gil, both weathered men in their 50s who regarded the new arrivals with the careful neutrality of people who'd learned not to comment on their employer's personal choices, work the cattle. He asked the way he asked for everything he really wanted, which was to make it sound like he didn't care that much, just in case the answer was no. Silas said yes. He handed Thomas a pair of work gloves 2 sizes too big and said, "Don't touch the fence line. It's barbed on the north section. And stay behind Gil when we're moving them." Thomas took the gloves with both hands and held them the way he'd held the carved horse. He came back in at midday with dirt on his boots and a kind of careful happiness on his face, like he was afraid to let it be all the way real. He sat down next to May and showed her a small stone he'd found near the creek, flat and gray with a faint stripe of pink through it, and said, "I'm going to keep this." May examined the stone with appropriate seriousness and handed it back. "You can hold it if you want," Thomas said. May considered this offer. She held the stone for approximately 45 seconds and then gave it back and returned to her doll. She held it for almost a minute, Thomas told Rosalie later, with the tone of someone reporting an important development. "I know," Rosalie said. "I saw." "That's a lot for May." "It is." Thomas polished the stone on his shirt and set it on the shelf next to the carved horse. "I think she likes it here," he said. Then he looked sideways at Rosalie, uncertain. "Do you?" She could hear the real question under it. "Are we staying?" He hadn't asked directly. He was 5 years old and he had learned the hard way that asking directly was how you set yourself up to be hurt. Rosalie sat on the edge of his bed and said, "I'm still figuring it out." Thomas nodded, accepting this. "I like the horses," he said. "I know you do." "And Mr. Granger said if I'm good for 2 weeks, he'll let me help with the morning feed." "That sounds fair?" Thomas turned his stone over in his hands. He didn't have to say 2 weeks. He could have said never, and that would have been true too, and we couldn't have said anything. Rosalie looked at her son, this small, careful, grave-eyed boy who was already doing the math of powerlessness. "You're right," she said. "He could have, but he didn't." "No, he didn't." Thomas set the stone down with a kind of finality, like the subject was closed. "Okay," he said. The most complicated moments of that first week happened in the evenings, when the work was done and the children were in various stages of winding down, and there was nothing to do but exist in the same space. Silas didn't make a production of it. He sat in the chair near the stove and read or worked on something. Once it was a piece of leather he was repairing. Once it was a set of accounts from the ranch that he went over with a worn pencil, occasionally writing something and occasionally crossing it out. He didn't talk for the sake of talking. He didn't ask Rosalie questions she wasn't ready to answer. He didn't perform ease. Rosalie sat at the table and mended and watched him out of the corner of her eye and turned over everything she knew about him in her mind, the way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath. The problem was that every time she found what she expected to be the underside, the impatience, the resentment. The moment when the real man emerged from behind the patient one, it wasn't there. On the fourth evening, she couldn't help herself. "Why did you want this?" she asked. He looked up from the leather he was working on. "This," she said, "a wife you didn't know, 3 children, all of it." He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone avoiding the question, she'd learned to tell the difference, but the quiet of someone who was deciding how much truth to give. "I had a ranch," he said finally, "and nobody to leave it to." "You could have found a wife without children." "I could have." "Then why specifically?" "Because I wanted something that was already alive," he said. "I didn't want to start from scratch and build something slow. I wanted to walk into a life that was already happening." He paused. "That probably sounds strange." It didn't sound strange. It sounded like something she hadn't been expecting him to say, which meant she had no immediate defense against it. "It's honest," she said. "I try to be." She looked down at the sock she was mending and said, without quite meaning to, "Most men looked at my letters and saw 3 problems." "I know." "You didn't." "No." "Why not?" He set the leather down in his lap and looked at her directly, which he didn't always do, not because he was evasive, but because he understood that eye contact pressed on people, and he'd seemed to understand from the beginning that she was someone who needed space to breathe. "When I was 11, he said, "my mother had 4 boys under 13 and my father got sick and couldn't work for 2 years. She managed everything, the ranch, the money, us. She never once made us feel like a burden, even when we must have been." He picked the leather back up. "I've spent a long time believing that a woman holding 4 things at once isn't carrying a burden. She's just capable. I wanted capable." Rosalie looked at him for a long time. "I'm also exhausted," she said, because it was true, and because she didn't want him thinking he'd found something simple. "I know that too," he said. "You've been doing this alone for over a year. You're allowed to be tired." She opened her mouth and then closed it, because no one had said that to her. Not once. Everyone had said variations of "you're so strong" or "you're managing so well," or, in Margaret's case, "you need to think practically." But no one had simply said "you're allowed to be tired" and left it there, without a suggestion attached. It caught her somewhere behind the sternum and stayed there. She bent over her mending so he wouldn't see her face. The moment that changed Clara happened on a Thursday, 8 days in. Rosalie had been in the garden, a small, neglected square near the house that she'd been quietly reclaiming with the stubborn intention of someone who needed something to grow. When she heard voices from the direction of the barn, she straightened up and listened. Clara's voice first, sharp and defensive. "I didn't ask for your help." Then Silas, level. "I know." "Then why are you standing there?" "Because you've been in here for an hour and it's nearly lunchtime and I need to get to the tack room." "The tack room is on the other side." A pause. "That's true. So you don't need to come through here." "No." "So you were checking on me." Another pause. "Maybe." Clara's voice went harder. "I don't need to be checked on. I'm not a baby. I'm 8. I know how old you are." "Then why—" "Clara?" His voice was still level, but there was something underneath it now, not impatience, something more like honesty. "I'm not going to pretend I wasn't walking over here to see if you were all right. You went quiet after breakfast and you've been in here a long time and I noticed. That's all. I'm not trying to interfere with anything." Silence. Then Clara. "How'd you notice? You were working the fence." "I can work a fence and notice things at the same time." Another silence, longer this time. "My dad used to check on me," Clara said. And then, as if she'd said too much, "I mean, he used to." Rosalie had gone very still in the garden. "What was he like?" Silas asked. Clara didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was different, younger, somehow. Not the armored 8-year-old, but the girl underneath her. "Loud," she said. "He laughed loud. It was kind of embarrassing sometimes. At church and stuff, everyone would look." A pause. "I miss it, the loud laughing. The house is really quiet now." "Yeah," Silas said. "It is. You're quiet." "I know. I've always been quiet." "It's different quiet," Clara said, with the precision of someone who had thought about this. "It's not the same as the quiet after he died. That quiet was like something was missing. Your quiet is just you." Rosalie pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. "That's a careful thing to say," Silas said. I'm a careful person, Clara said. I know. I don't trust people easily. I've noticed that too. I'm not going to just decide to trust you because you fixed my shoe and brought apples. I'm not asking you to. Good. I'm asking you to. He seemed to stop and reconsider. Actually, I'm not asking you for anything. You've already got enough people asking things of you. The longest silence yet. Rosalie heard Clara shift, the scuff of her boots on the barn floor. You can use the tack room, Clara said finally. I was done in here anyway. Thanks. Footsteps. A pause. Mr. Granger. Yeah. Did you have a dad who checked on you? A beat. I did. He died when I was 17. Oh. Clara absorbed this. Was he loud? Not at all. Quietest man in the county. Did you miss him? Every day. Still do. Rosalie heard Clara's boots on the barn floor, moving toward the door. Before she got there, she said, I'm not saying I trust you yet. Okay. I'm just saying that quiet isn't always bad. No, Silas said. It isn't. Rosalie waited until she heard Clara's footsteps going toward the house. And then she stood in the garden with her dirty hands and her heart doing something irregular and complicated, and she stared at the scrubby patch of earth she'd been trying to reclaim, and she thought, this is the part where it starts to cost something, because she could keep her own walls up. She'd been doing that for years, but she could not keep her children from feeling what they felt and what they were starting to feel. All of them, even Clara, even stubborn, armored 8-year-old Clara, was something that looked dangerously like safety. And safety was the most expensive thing in the world to lose. She went back to the garden and pulled weeds until her hands ached. The first real argument happened at the end of that same week, and it was not what she'd expected. She'd been handling May's hair, a morning negotiation that required patience and a specific song and a stuffed doll held at precise angles, when she heard raised voices from the yard. Not angry raised voices, frustrated raised voices. She finished May's braid and went to the window. Thomas was standing next to Gil at the fence line. One of the younger steers had gotten its leg tangled in something. She couldn't see what from the window. And Thomas had apparently tried to help and had done something wrong because Gil was talking at him in the tone of someone explaining a mistake. Not unkindly, but without softening it much either. And Thomas had gone white in the face and still in the way that meant he was about 3 seconds from crying and trying not to. She was halfway to the door when she heard Silas's voice from somewhere to the left, out of her line of sight. Gil. Just telling the boy what he did wrong, Gil said. He needs to know. He knows. Back off. A pause. Then Gil, with the tone of someone who respected the man he worked for but had opinions of his own. I wasn't yelling at him. I know you weren't. Give him a minute. She heard Gil move away. She stayed at the window. Silas crouched down near the steer's leg and said something to Thomas that she couldn't hear. Thomas said something back. Silas said something. Thomas wiped his face with the back of his hand in the quick, furtive gesture of someone making sure no evidence remained. Then Silas showed him something about the tangle, some way to approach it, and let Thomas do the next part himself. When the steer's leg came free and it moved away, Thomas stood up straighter. Silas stood too and clapped him once on the shoulder, the kind of contact that didn't ask anything, just confirmed something, and went back toward the barn. Thomas stood at the fence line for another moment, alone. Then he picked up the flat pink-striped stone from where he'd apparently left it on the fence post. He'd taken to carrying it with him, she'd noticed, and put it in his pocket and followed. That evening, Rosalie told Silas, while they were both in the kitchen after the children were in bed, "You didn't have to step in with Gil today." "I know." Thomas makes mistakes. He needs to learn from them. He was learning, Silas said. Gil keeps going after someone's already learned the lesson. It stops being teaching and starts being something else. Rosalie considered this. You've thought about this. I have 2 hired hands, and I've made enough mistakes with both of them to know the difference. You made mistakes with your workers. Of course I did. I was 23 when I bought this place, and I didn't know what I was doing, and I said things wrong and pushed things wrong, and I lost 2 good men in the first year because of it. He was at the counter, pouring out what was left of the evening coffee into the sink, his back to her. I've been figuring out how to manage people my whole adult life. I'm still figuring it out. She hadn't thought about him that way. As someone still learning, still making errors, still accumulating information about how to be. She'd been so focused on what he did right that she hadn't much considered that he was working at it. What's the hardest part? She asked, before she could think better of it. He turned around and leaned back against the counter, knowing when to step in and when to stay out. Still get that wrong sometimes. He looked at her. Probably going to get it wrong with your kids, too. You will, she agreed. I know. He didn't seem troubled by this. I'd rather get it wrong and fix it than not try at all. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Thomas told me tonight that he thinks Midnight might be his favorite horse. He's got good taste. He said you told him how to tell if a horse trusts you or is just tolerating you. Silas almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile. She'd noticed he rarely gave full ones, as though they were something he was careful with. There's a difference. He said you told him most people don't notice the difference. Most people don't. He said, she stopped, tried again. He said he wants to learn to notice. Silas looked at her in the lamplight, and this time there was something in his face that she didn't have an immediate word for. Something careful and real. He will, Silas said. He's already good at it. He just doesn't know yet. She picked up the lamp from the table and said goodnight and went down the hall to her room, and she sat on the edge of her bed in the dark after she set the lamp down, and she pressed her hands flat on her knees and breathed. She was falling in too fast. She could feel it. The way the ground that had seemed solid under her feet for the past week was shifting, softening. She was starting to believe in this house, in this man, in the shape of what they were building here, and she hadn't given herself permission to do that. She needed to be careful. She needed to remember that she had been wrong before about things seeming safe. She needed to remember Margaret Hollis in her kitchen saying leavings. She repeated these things to herself in the dark until she was calm enough to lie down. It didn't entirely work, but it helped. The following week, Rosalie found the garden fully turned. She stood at the back door in the early morning and stared. She had been slowly clearing the old bed herself, working around the children's schedules, around the housework, around everything else, making small progress that she was proud of in the particular private way of something you do for yourself with no expectation of recognition. She'd maybe done a third of it. Now the whole thing was turned, good dark soil evenly broken up, the edge stones reset in a cleaner line than she'd managed. Pete, one of the hired hands, was walking past with a bucket, and she said, "Did you do the garden?" Pete gave her a look that said very clearly, "Ask someone else," and kept walking. She waited until the morning work was done, and then she found Silas checking the fence on the south side, and she said, "You did the garden." He kept his eyes on the fence. "You were making progress." "I was making my progress," she said. "I was doing it myself." He turned then, reading her tone. "I overstepped." "Yes." "I'm sorry." She looked at him for a moment. He meant it. She'd learned to tell when people meant apologies and when they were just reflexively producing the word to make the discomfort stop. He meant it. "Why?" she asked. "Because you were going to bed tired every night and the kids needed things from you all day, and I thought—" He stopped. "I thought it would help. I didn't think about what it meant to you that you were doing it yourself." She sat with that for a moment. "It means," she said slowly, "that it's the only thing here that's mine so far, that I'm building. Everything else already existed before we got here, your house, your land, your animals, your routine. The garden was the one thing I was making from the beginning." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I won't do that again." She believed him. That was the thing. She believed him, and she wasn't used to believing people quickly. "I know you meant to help," she said. "That's not an excuse." "No, but it matters." She walked back toward the house, and then she stopped and turned. "Silas." He was watching her. "The south corner," she said, "where the soil goes hard. Do you know what'll grow there?" A pause. "Lavender," he said. "Maybe yarrow. Things that don't need much." She nodded. "All right." She went inside. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the turned garden for a moment, imperfect gesture, fully meant. And she let herself keep something she'd been putting down every day for the past 2 weeks. She let herself want this to work. Not fully. Not completely. She still kept her foot near the door, still watched for the flinch that hadn't come, still braced for the moment things shifted. But she let herself want it, just a little, which was more than she'd allowed before. May was at the kitchen table with her doll and the carved horse arranged in front of her in whatever configuration made sense to a 3-year-old, and she was looking at them with the focused attention she gave to everything important. Rosalie sat down across from her and watched. After a moment, May picked up the carved horse and walked it very slowly across the table toward the doll. Then she walked it back. Then she did it again. Rosalie said nothing. May walked the horse toward the doll a third time, and this time she set it right next to the doll and left it there. Then she looked up at Rosalie. Her face was serious, as always. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of something that in another child would have been ordinary, but in May was rare enough that Rosalie's breath caught. It was the look of someone who had decided something. Rosalie said very carefully, "Do they know each other now?" May looked at the horse and the doll, then back at Rosalie. She nodded, one single, deliberate nod. Rosalie nodded back. "Good," she said. "That's good." Outside the window. The Montana sky was doing what it did this time of year, wide and blue and so enormous it made everything under it look small and manageable by comparison. The hired hands were moving somewhere in the distance. The cattle were doing whatever cattle did. And from the direction of the barn she could hear Thomas's voice, bright and rising, asking Silas something about midnight, and Silas's lower voice answering, and then Thomas's laugh, the full one, the one she hadn't heard in 14 months, the one she'd been afraid she might not hear again. She kept her hands flat on the table and listened to it. It lasted only a few seconds. But those few seconds were enough to make every wall she'd been building overnight feel slightly less necessary, and every bracing she'd been doing feel slightly less sane, and every fear she'd been carrying feel slightly less like wisdom, and slightly more like a habit she might, eventually, be able to put down. She was not there yet. She was nowhere near there yet. But her son was laughing in a barn in Montana, and her silent daughter had introduced a carved horse to a rag doll and declared them acquainted, and her oldest child had told a quiet man that his particular silence wasn't the wrong kind. Rosalie Ashcroft looked at the garden through the kitchen window, turned earth, ready for something, imperfect at the edges but solid at the center, and she thought, maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. That was more than she'd had in a very long time. 3 weeks into Montana, Rosalie planted lavender in the south corner of the garden. She did it on a Saturday morning while the children were occupied. Thomas with Gil in the morning feed, Clara at the creek with a book she'd found on Silas's shelf and taken without asking, which Silas had noticed and said nothing about, which was exactly the right response. May was on the back step with her doll and the carved horse, conducting whatever negotiation she'd been conducting between the two of them since the morning she'd introduced them. Rosalie got her hands in the dirt and worked, and she didn't think about anything in particular, which was the closest she'd come to peace in a very long time. The lavender had come from a small cutting Silas had mentioned, offhandedly, that he'd seen growing wild near the east fence. He hadn't said, "I'll get you some." He just said there's lavender out east, goes wild near the fence line, and the next morning there was a bundle of cuttings on the back step, roots wrapped in a wet cloth, with no note because apparently Silas Granger was constitutionally opposed to announcing the kind things he did. She had stood at the back door looking at those cuttings for a full minute before she picked them up. She planted them now in the corner where the soil went hard, the way he'd said, things that don't need much. She pressed the earth around each one with both hands and thought about how strange it was to be here, doing this, in this particular life that 3 months ago she would not have been able to imagine. She thought about the morning she'd received his first letter. She thought about the train. She thought about his face at the station, the way he'd held his hat. She was not a woman who romanticized things. She was too tired for that and had been for too long. But she was capable of recognizing when something was different, and this was different, and she'd run out of arguments against letting herself know it. What she had not yet run out of was fear. The two things lived side by side in her chest like neighbors who'd agreed not to speak to each other. The wanting and the terror of wanting. She'd made her peace with both being there. She had not made her peace with what would happen if the fear turned out to be right. She pressed the last cutting into the soil and sat back on her heels and looked at the row of small, unpromising things she'd planted, and she thought, grow. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. She recognized Margaret Hollis's handwriting on the envelope before she'd even picked it up from where Pete had left it on the kitchen table, and she felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. She didn't open it right away. She put it under a book on the shelf and let it sit there for the better part of a day while she went about the ordinary work of being alive in this house, meals and mending, and the particular domestic geography of 4 people learning to share space without collision. She was good at putting things off. She'd learned it as a survival skill. Some things needed time to become less dangerous before you touched them. She opened it after supper, when the children were in bed and Silas was in the barn dealing with something Pete had flagged about the south fence. She sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight and read. Margaret had written 4 pages. The first page was about Kansas City, about the weather, about a neighbor's business that had gone under. The second page was about Daniel, not mourning him, but referencing him as a kind of credential, the way Margaret always did, as though having been his sister gave her authority over everything he'd left behind. The third page was where it started. I've been thinking about you out there, Rosalie, and I want to be honest with you the way families should be. You went out there with nothing but hope and 3 children, and I understand why you did it. I do. But you need to think carefully about what you're building and who you're building it with. A man who answers a matrimonial notice and specifically asks for a woman with children is not a man looking for a wife. He's a man looking for something else, labor or company, or to fill some gap in himself that a normal woman wouldn't tolerate. I've asked around and no one here knows anything about a Silas Granger. That isn't necessarily suspicious, but it isn't reassuring either. What I'm saying is, don't let yourself get comfortable before you're certain. Don't let the children get attached before you're certain. And if he ever shows you who he really is, and they all do, eventually, you come home. The children know me. This is familiar ground. Familiar is worth something. The 4th page was logistics. How much it would cost to get back. Which trains ran which days. A neighbor who'd hold a room. Rosalie read all 4 pages twice. Then she folded the letter and held it in her hands and looked at the lamp flame for a long time. The thing about Margaret was that she wasn't wrong about everything. She wasn't entirely wrong about anything. A man who answered matrimonial notices was sometimes what Margaret said he was. Familiar ground was worth something, and they all did eventually show you something. The question was always what. But Margaret had also stood in her kitchen in Kansas City and said leavings loud enough for Clara to hear it. And Margaret had said practical solution about the most personal, most terrifying decision Rosalie had made in her adult life. And Margaret's 4 pages were written without a single question. Not how are you, not how are the children, not is it working. Just the conclusion she'd already reached before she'd written a word. Rosalie put the letter in the back of the shelf under the book and decided she was not going to think about it that night. She thought about it for the next 3 days. She didn't tell Silas. She wasn't sure why. It wasn't that she thought he'd react badly. It was more that the letter felt like a test she needed to administer to herself, privately, without his awareness. She needed to know what she believed when she was just inside her own head, without the warmth of his presence influencing her. What she found, turning it over in those 3 days, was that she believed him. Not blindly, not without the evidence she'd been gathering since the station, the shoe, the apples, the way he'd spoken to Clara in the barn, the carved horse with the chipped ear, the lavender cuttings on the back step, the way he'd said back off to Gil without making a performance of it, the way he'd apologized about the garden and meant it. Not without any of that, but she believed him. The fear was still there. It didn't go away just because she believed him. It sat in its usual spot in her chest and waited, the way it always did, for the moment she'd let herself trust something and been proven wrong. The fear was a scar, not a wound. It wasn't bleeding anymore, but it would always be sensitive. She made her peace with that distinction, and on the 3rd day she took the letter out from behind the book and burned it in the kitchen stove. Not in anger, not dramatically. She just folded it once and put it in the firebox and watched it go. Then she went back to the garden. The night everything came apart started so ordinarily that Rosalie would later think about how that was always the way. Catastrophe didn't announce itself. It came in through the side door while you were looking somewhere else. May had been fussy all day, not in her usual contained, quiet way, but in an unsettled, restless way that Rosalie had noticed and put down to tiredness, or a new tooth, or the particular moodiness that sometimes came over small children without explanation. She'd eaten poorly at lunch, picked at her supper, and had gone to bed earlier than usual without her customary deliberate arrangement of the doll and the carved horse. That should have been the sign. May's rituals were sacred. She had never skipped them voluntarily. Rosalie checked her at 9 o'clock and found her sleeping, but something about the quality of her sleep was wrong. Too still, too flat, the way children slept when they weren't resting but surrendering. She put her hand on May's forehead and felt the heat, and the world went sideways. It was not a slight warmth. It was the kind of heat that meant something was happening inside a body that should not be happening. Rosalie stood in the dark of May's room with her hand on her daughter's forehead, and she went completely, totally calm. This was what she did when things were worst. She did not panic. She did not make noise. She became so calm and so focused that it felt from the outside like she was made of something other than ordinary material. People had always interpreted this as strength. She knew it was something else. It was the part of her that went cold and mechanical when emotion would cost her. The part that had developed in the hours after Daniel died when she'd had to tell 3 children that their father was gone. The part that did what needed doing and felt the feeling later. She went to the kitchen. She filled a bowl with cold water. She found the cotton cloths. She went back to May. May woke up part way when Rosalie started with the cloth and made a sound that was not a cry exactly, more like a complaint, faint and confused, the sound of a child who didn't understand why she felt the way she felt. "I know," Rosalie said. "I know, baby. I've got you." She worked the cloth along May's neck and forehead and watched the small face for signs of the things she was most afraid of. Daniel had been feverish for 2 days before it became clear the pneumonia had him. His fever had come and gone and come back worse, and she hadn't known. She hadn't known enough to know how bad it was getting, and then it was too late to know anything. She knew more now. She knew what the bad signs looked like. She watched for them. She did not hear Silas in the hall until he was already in the doorway, which meant he moved quietly in the dark and had been awake, which she hadn't known. "What's wrong?" he said, and his voice was the voice of someone who had woken already alert, not groggy, not pulling himself out of sleep, but immediately present. It was a particular voice, and she didn't stop to think about what it meant. "Fever," she said. "Bad one. There's a doctor in town, isn't there, you said? Whitmore, he's in Mill Haven. How far?" 2 hours by horse in the dark." He was already gone from the doorway before she'd finished the sentence. She kept working the cloth. She kept her voice even when she spoke to May. She kept the cold and the mechanical and the capable running on top of everything else, the way she always did. And underneath it, in the part of her she wasn't using right now, she was terrified in a way she hadn't been since the morning she'd realized Daniel wasn't getting better. Thomas appeared in the doorway 15 minutes later with his stone in his hand and his eyes wide. "Is May sick?" "Yes." "How sick?" Rosalie looked at her son, 5 years old, grave-eyed, already old enough to understand that sick could mean different things. "I don't know yet," she said. "I'm taking care of her. Go back to bed, Thomas." "I don't want to." "I know you don't. Go back to bed anyway. I need you to sleep so you're not tired and underfoot tomorrow." He stood there for a moment longer, the stone held tight in both hands. Then he went. Clara appeared 30 seconds later. "I heard Thomas," she said. "Go back to bed, Clara." "Is May going to be okay?" Rosalie looked at her oldest child. This 8-year-old who'd been carrying things no 8-year-old should carry, who'd learned to ask the direct question because the indirect one had let her down too many times. "I don't know," Rosalie said again. "Mr. Granger went for the doctor. I'm doing everything I can. Go back to bed." Clara looked at May, small and flushed, and too still under the blanket. Something moved across Clara's face that she couldn't quite keep out of it. "I'll stay up," Clara said. "You'll sleep." "Mom." "Clara." She kept her voice quiet so it wouldn't wake May further, but she put everything into it. "I need you to trust me right now. I need you to go to bed and let me handle this and trust that I'm going to handle it. Can you do that?" A long pause. "Yes," Clara said, and went. The next hour was the longest of Rosalie's recent life. She worked the cold cloth and changed the water when it warmed and spoke to May in a low, continuous murmur. Nothing in particular, just words, just the sound of her voice, which was the thing May needed more than any other specific thing. May drifted in and out of a restless half-sleep. Her fever didn't break, but it didn't climb either, which was the only good news Rosalie had to hold on to. She thought about Daniel. She couldn't help it. This room, this child, this particular quality of fear, it was too close. The memory of those 2 days before they lost him sat right at the surface, trying to get in. She kept it back the way you kept a door shut against wind. Not without effort, not without strain, but held. She did not let herself think about what it would mean to lose May. She thought about the lavender in the south corner instead. She thought about it growing, small and stubborn, in soil that didn't give much. She thought about things that didn't need much to survive. She was on her 4th change of water when she heard the horses. She heard them before she heard voices. Hoofbeats on the hard ground. 2 horses, coming fast and then slowing as they came into the yard. Then Silas's voice, brief, directing someone. Then boots on the step. The doctor was a small man in his 60s named Whitmore, with the unhurried manner of someone who'd seen enough emergencies to know that panic didn't help them. He came into May's room with his bag, nodded once at Rosalie as though confirming she'd done the right things, and bent over May. Rosalie stood back. She did this the way she did difficult things, by making herself very still and holding the capable part up where she needed it, and not letting herself think about anything except the next thing. Silas came to stand near the doorway. He'd ridden 2 hours in the dark, and his coat was damp from where the cold had gotten through, and there was mud on his boots, and he looked, for the first time since she'd known him, like a man who'd been running on something beyond ordinary energy. But his face was steady. He didn't say anything. He didn't crowd the room. He stood near the door and he was there, which was the only thing she needed him to be. Dr. Whitmore examined May with careful, thorough hands, and then stood up and said, "Fever's high, but it's not the worst I've seen. No rattling in the lungs, which is the good sign. I want to see how she does in the next few hours. If it breaks before morning, she'll likely come through fine. If it climbs before it breaks, we'll need to work harder." He looked at Rosalie. "You've been managing her well. Keep at it." "How long could this last?" Rosalie said. "Couple of days sometimes. Could break sooner." He set his bag down and took out several things, giving her clear instructions for each. "I'll stay through the night. I'll sleep in the chair." "You don't have to. I came out here at midnight," he said, with a mild dryness. "I'm not riding back in the dark." She almost smiled, which was not an expression she'd thought she was capable of in the last hour. Dr. Whitmore settled into the chair near the window with the professional ease of a man who'd slept in worse places. Rosalie sat on the edge of May's bed and took up the cloth again. Silas brought 2 cups of coffee from the kitchen and set one near the doctor and one near Rosalie without being asked, and then went to the kitchen himself and stayed there, which was the right decision. The room was full enough. Around 2 in the morning, Clara appeared again. She came so quietly that Rosalie didn't hear her until she was standing at the edge of the bed. She was carrying May's rag doll, which she'd retrieved from wherever it had gotten to in the upset of the evening, and she set it carefully near May's hand. May's fingers moved. She found the doll without opening her eyes, the way she always found it, and closed her hand around it. Clara stood and watched this for a moment. Then she went and sat in the corner of the room, pulled her knees to her chest, and stayed. Rosalie looked at her and then looked away and didn't say, "Go back to bed," because she understood, finally, that she would not go. Clara was 80 years old and her sister was sick, and she was not going anywhere, and insisting she leave would cost more than letting her stay. "If you fall asleep in that corner, you'll have a terrible neck in the morning," Rosalie said. "I won't fall asleep," Clara said. She fell asleep in approximately 40 minutes, sideways against the wall, which Rosalie covered with the spare blanket from the chest without waking her. Dr. Whitmore glanced up from his doze. "Good girl," he said quietly. "She's difficult," Rosalie said. "Good girls usually are," he said, and went back to dozing. Silas appeared in the doorway around 3, moving quietly. He looked at May, then at Rosalie, and said, just above a whisper, "How is she?" "Same. Tonight—" He stopped. Started again. "Can I sit with her for a little? Give you a break?" She was about to say no. She'd been about to say no because that was her default, because May was hers, because sitting with May through a crisis was not something she was ready to share, because, and here was the real thing, she was afraid to move, afraid that if she stepped away from this bedside, something would go wrong in the gap. She looked at him standing in the doorway with mud on his boots and shadows under his eyes, and she remembered that he had ridden 2 hours in the dark without being asked, and she said, "Yes, 10 minutes." She went to the kitchen. She sat at the table and put her hands flat on the wood and took 10 full breaths. She drank the cold coffee that was there and didn't taste it. She stared at the lamp. She heard Silas's voice from the bedroom, low, almost inaudible. She couldn't hear the words, just the tone. The same tone he used for the horses, she realized. The quiet, patient, level thing that said, "I'm here and I'm not going anywhere and you're all right." She pressed her hands harder on the table. She had not let herself fall apart in a very long time. There was never a good time for it. There was always a child who needed something, always a next thing that had to happen. She'd learned to compress the falling apart into very small moments and very private ones, and even then she didn't let it go all the way. She managed it. She managed it now. She took one breath that was too long and too sharp, and then she straightened up and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for a count of 5. And then she was all right again. She went back to May's room. May's fever broke just before 5 in the morning. It broke the way fevers broke. Not dramatically, not like a turning point in a story, just a gradual shift in the quality of the heat under Rosalie's hand, a slight loosening in the small body. And then May opening her eyes fully for the first time in hours and saying, in a thin, bewildered voice, "Mama." Rosalie said, "Here." That was all she could manage. Dr. Whitmore was awake and had a hand on May's pulse in under 10 seconds. He nodded, and the nod said everything. Clara jerked awake in her corner and scrambled to her feet with wild hair and said, "What?" And Rosalie said, "She's better." And Clara sat back down on the floor and put her hands over her face and sat there for a moment, and Rosalie let her, because it was the first time she'd ever seen her oldest child need to put her hands over her face, and it deserved to be respected. Thomas was in the hallway. She didn't know how long he'd been there, but when she came to the door, he was there with his stone in his hand and his face very young. "She okay?" he said. "She's going to be okay," Rosalie said. Thomas let out a breath that was more than a breath. It was the sound of a child releasing something he'd been holding very tightly. She went to the kitchen to tell Silas. "I was standing at the window with a cup of coffee, watching the sky go light in the east, and when she came in, he turned and read her face before she said a word, and something moved through his expression that was complicated and real and not at all composed. "She's better," Rosalie said. He let out a slow breath. He turned back to the window. He stood there for a moment, and she watched his jaw work slightly, the way a person's jaw worked when they were deciding how much of themselves to show. Then he said quietly, "My brothers' names were James and Owen." She waited. "Fever took James when he was 6, Silas said. Owen was 9, same winter, different fevers. I was 14. He was quiet for a long moment. "I've never been in a room with a sick child and not thought about them." Rosalie stood still. "I didn't tell you that because I wanted credit," he said. "I'm telling you because I didn't ride for the doctor for 2 hours in the dark because it was the right thing to do. I rode because I couldn't have done anything else. Because that little girl in there is—" He stopped. He seemed to be having some difficulty with language, which she'd never seen from him before. "She matters," he said finally. "All of them matter. And I needed you to know that it's not—" Another stop. "It's not theoretical for me. It's not me being good at this. I just couldn't have done differently." The kitchen went very quiet. Rosalie thought about 14 months of doing everything alone. She thought about the particular silence of a house where the person who was supposed to be beside you was gone. She thought about all the nights she'd lain awake being the only one. She thought about a man who had ridden 2 hours in the dark without being asked, because he couldn't have done differently. She said, "Tell me about them." He looked at her. "James and Owen," she said. "Tell me about them." He turned from the window. He sat down at the kitchen table, and she sat across from him. And outside the window, Montana was going from dark to pale gray to the first real light of morning, and he told her about his brothers. James had been small for his age and furious about it. He'd fought every boy in the county at least once by the time he was 5, not from meanness, but from sheer refusal to be overlooked. He'd had a gap between his front teeth and a laugh that his mother said came straight from the devil's own sense of humor. He'd wanted, when he grew up, to be a sheriff. He'd had strong opinions about this and had shared them frequently. Owen had been different, tall, early, quiet, watchful. He'd had a talent for fixing things that shouldn't have worked and didn't. He could coax a dead stove back to life and repair a fence post that had no business standing, and tell you, with complete accuracy, exactly when rain was coming by something he felt in the air. He'd wanted to build things. He'd said once, when he was 8, that he was going to build a bridge someday, a real one, over a real river, and nobody had laughed because the way he said it made you believe him. Silas told her these things in the early morning light with a cup of coffee he'd stopped drinking, and his voice was steady, but there was a quality to it that she recognized. The voice of someone who kept these things in a room they didn't usually open. When he finished, they sat in silence for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said. 14 years, he said. "I've had time." "No, it's not." "Do your parents know? Are they? My mother's alive. She's in Helena with my aunt. She's well." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I write to her." "Does she know about us?" A slight pause. "I told her I was sending for a family." A family, Rosalie said. Yes. She looked at the table. Then she said, What did she say? She said it was about time. Rosalie almost laughed. It was the shock of it, partly. The laugh came from somewhere she hadn't been using. She put her hand over her mouth and it came out anyway, brief and genuine and slightly ragged around the edges. Silas watched her with the expression he used for things that mattered to him. She'd like you, he said. You don't know that. She likes capable women with dirt on their hands who don't tolerate nonsense, he said. She'd like you. Rosalie looked at her hands, which did in fact have a faint line of garden soil along the knuckle creases that she'd been too tired to fully scrub out the previous evening. She thought about a woman in Helena who had lost 2 sons to winter fevers and still called this life worth living. She thought about what kind of person you became on the other side of losses like that. She thought about how you built something after the ground had given way twice. I'd like to meet her, she said, and meant it. Dr. Whitmore left after breakfast, declining payment with the firmness of a man who had made decisions about such things long ago and did not revisit them. He shook Silas's hand and told Rosalie to keep May quiet for a few days and to send for him at once if the fever returned, and then he took his horse and his bag and went back down the road toward Millhaven. Rosalie stood on the front step watching him go. She was exhausted in the particular way of a long, sleepless, high-stakes night, the kind where the tension holds you upright past the point where you'd otherwise fall over, and then the relief releases it all at once. Her bones felt like they'd been replaced with something that didn't hold shape as well. Her eyes felt like the inside of her eyelids were made of something rough. She needed to sleep. She needed several hours of not being responsible for anything. She was standing there calculating how to arrange the morning so that she could have this. Whether Thomas could go with Pete and Gil, whether Clara could manage May for a few hours with May mostly sleeping anyway. When Silas came and stood beside her on the step and said, I've got the children. You've got an operation to run, she said. Pete and Gil have the operation. I employ them for a reason. That doesn't mean Rosalie. He said her name with the same patience he gave everything, and she heard what was in it. Go sleep. I have this. I have all of it. 4 or 5 hours. Nothing is going to go wrong. She looked at him sideways. He was still in the same clothes he'd ridden out in. He'd had as little sleep as she had. He was standing there looking entirely serious and entirely present and entirely ready to manage the day. You need sleep too, she said. I'll sleep after you do. She looked at him for a long moment. If May needs, I'll wake you. If Thomas, I've got Thomas. Clara is asleep on May's floor, and I'm going to let her sleep there until she wakes up herself, he said. I'll tell her it was my idea when she does. She'll be annoyed at me, which will make her feel normal. Rosalie stared at him. She hadn't thought of that. She hadn't thought of the specific strategy of redirecting Clara's energy by giving her something to be annoyed about that didn't cost anything. It was so exactly right that it temporarily stopped her thoughts. That's a good idea, she said. I have them occasionally. She almost laughed again. 2 almost laughs in one morning was more than she'd had in a long time. She went inside. She went to her room. She lay down on her bed in her clothes, and she was asleep before she'd finished the thought she'd been starting to have. She slept for 4.5 hours. When she woke, the house was not quiet. It was the particular busy sound of a house with children being managed by someone who'd done their research. Low voices, deliberate redirection, the sound of something being built or arranged in the kitchen, May's thin voice asking for something and being answered. She lay still for a moment, just listening. She heard Silas say something to May that she couldn't quite make out. She heard May say clearly and without prompting, "Okay." Rosalie lay very still. May had not volunteered a word to anyone but Rosalie and Thomas in the 3 weeks since they'd arrived. She'd nodded to Silas once, weeks ago, and that had felt enormous. She had not said an unprompted word to him. Okay. Rosalie closed her eyes again for a moment. She thought about the rag doll and the carved horse, sitting side by side on the kitchen table the morning May had introduced them. She thought about how long that had taken, how carefully May had worked her way toward that single gesture. She thought about the kind of trust that moved like that, in tiny increments, in the language of small objects and single nods, and one word offered to a man who had not pushed for any of them. She thought about herself. She was 39 years old. She had 3 children and a suitcase that had seen better days and a patch of lavender in the south corner of a garden that she was making hers. She had been afraid, consistently and productively, for 14 months. And the fear had kept her moving, and the fear had kept her upright, and the fear had served its purpose. She was not ready to put it down. She wasn't sure she'd ever be entirely ready. But she thought, lying in the late morning light with Montana moving outside the window and her daughter's voice coming from the kitchen and Silas Granger's low, steady voice answering her, that she might be moving, incrementally, in the language of small gestures and single concessions, toward something. Not perfect. Nothing here was going to be perfect, and she didn't want it to be. Perfect was a word for people who hadn't been through enough to know what things were actually made of. She wanted real. She wanted the chipped ear on the carved horse, and the imperfect braid she'd put in May's hair this morning, and the shoe that Silas had fixed better than she could have, but had still done without asking, and the argument about the garden, and the letter from Margaret that she'd burned, and the two brothers named James and Owen, and the moment in the barn when Clara had said his silence was not the wrong kind. She wanted all of it, the whole imperfect, working, difficult, alive shape of it. She got up. She went to the kitchen. Thomas looked up from where he was sitting at the table with the carved horse and the flat stone arranged in some configuration that made sense to him, and said, "You slept a long time." "I was tired," she said. "Mr. Granger made lunch." She looked at Silas, who was at the stove, and said, without turning around, "It's just soup. Don't—" He glanced back. "Don't act like it's something." "It's something," Thomas said firmly. May was at the table with her doll, looking at Rosalie with her serious, direct eyes. She looked better, still pale, still soft around the edges, but present in the way she hadn't been last night. Rosalie sat down beside her. May considered her for a moment. Then she picked up the rag doll and set it carefully in front of Rosalie, not offering it, not giving it away, just sharing it for a moment, putting it in Rosalie's space as a gesture of something that didn't have a name, but that Rosalie understood perfectly. She put her hand near the doll without touching it. May watched this. Then she picked the doll back up and settled it in her lap, and picked up her spoon for the soup that Silas was bringing to the table. Thomas said, "Can I have bread?" "There is bread," Silas said. "Can I have more bread?" "How much have you had?" "Only one piece." "Then yes, you can have more." Clara appeared from the hallway, rumpled and pillow-marked and carrying the blanket that had been put over her while she slept in May's corner. She looked at all of them. She looked at Silas. "You let me sleep on the floor," she said, with the tone of someone building a case. "You were already asleep," he said. "You should have woken me up." "Probably," he said, setting the bread on the table. "Sit down and eat something." Clara stood there for a moment longer, the blanket around her shoulders, her hair going in 4 directions, and on her face was an expression that Rosalie recognized from 14 months of watching this child try to hold herself apart from everything that might matter to her. It was losing the fight. Not all at once. Not completely. Clara would not do anything all at once or completely. That was not who she was. But the expression was losing, and Clara knew it was losing, and she pulled the blanket tighter and sat down at the table and picked up her spoon and said, "This better not be terrible." "It's not terrible," Thomas said. "You'd eat dirt if someone heated it up." "That's not true. I wouldn't eat dirt." "You ate a bug once." "That was one time and it was a mistake." "Children," Rosalie said, without heat. They subsided. Silas sat down at the table. There was a moment where everyone was just there, all 5 of them, in the kitchen, in the middle of an ordinary lunch that existed on the other side of a night that could have gone very differently. And nobody said anything in particular. May ate her soup. Thomas argued quietly with Clara about the bug. Rosalie held her spoon and looked at the table and at the doll in May's lap, and at the stone on Thomas's side of the table, and at Clara's wild hair, and at Silas across from her, who was watching all of them with the expression he wore for things that mattered to him. She thought, this is what he wanted, a life that was already happening. She thought, this is what I was afraid of. She thought, both things are true. She picked up her spoon and ate her soup, and outside the window the Montana sky was enormous and blue and indifferent to all of them, the way Montana always was. And the ranch went on being a ranch, and the children went on being children, and the fear sat in its usual spot in her chest alongside the other thing, the wanting, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she let them both exist without trying to quiet one at the expense of the other. It was not a resolution, it was not a turning point. It was just lunch, in a house that was becoming something, with people who were becoming something, after a night that had tested all of them and found them still here. That was enough. For right now, that was enough. May recovered slowly, the way small children did. Not in a straight line, but in a jagged one, good hours followed by tired ones. Appetite returning and then retreating, the color coming back to her face in stages rather than all at once. She spent 3 days mostly in bed, which for May meant 3 days of the rag doll and the carved horse, arranged with great precision on the blanket in front of her, while she watched the window with her usual focused attention, as though the Montana sky outside owed her an explanation for what had happened to her body. Rosalie stayed close. She'd always stayed close to her children during illness. It was one of the few places where her tendency to hold on felt appropriate rather than like something she needed to manage. But this time the closeness was different in quality. The night of the fever had shaken something loose in her, not her competence, not her ability to manage. Something else. Something she'd been keeping sealed. She noticed it in small ways. She noticed it in how she moved through the house. Less braced, somehow. Less prepared for the floor to give way. She'd spent 5 weeks in this house measuring every step against the possibility that the ground was temporary. And after the fever night, something in that calculation had shifted. She couldn't have said exactly what or why. She just noticed that she was walking differently. Silas gave them space during May's recovery without being asked. He checked in once in the morning and once in the evening, said something brief and specific. Not how is everyone, which was the kind of vague question that required a performance of fine. But did she eat today or fever still down? And then went back to the work of the ranch. He did not hover. He did not make the illness into a demonstration of his concern. He just kept the house running around the edges of it. Firewood, meals that appeared. Pete and Gil kept quiet near the house during the days, and let Rosalie do what she needed to do. Clara noticed this before Rosalie did. She came to the kitchen on the second morning of May's recovery and said, watching Silas through the window as he crossed the yard toward the barn, "He stays out of the way when we need him to." Rosalie was at the stove. "Yes. Most men don't do that." "No, they don't." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Hendricks, Daniel's friend, remember him? He used to come over after Dad died and just sit in the kitchen and expect someone to talk to him even when you were busy." "I remember. That was annoying." "It was," Rosalie agreed. "Silas doesn't do that." Clara used his first name without seeming to notice she'd done it, which told Rosalie everything about where that particular wall had gotten to. "He just does what's useful." "Yes." Clara picked up an apple from the bowl and turned it in her hands. "I've been thinking," she said. Rosalie waited. "I've been thinking that I've been watching him for something to be wrong," Clara said, with the directness she used for things she'd thought about a long time and had finally decided to say. "Like I was waiting for the bad version. And I haven't found it." She said this in the tone of someone reporting a result that surprised them. "I've been watching really carefully. I know you have. You have too." "Yes." Clara took a bite of the apple and chewed and said, "What do you think that means?" Rosalie looked at her oldest child, this fierce, careful, exhausted 8-year-old who had been doing the emotional accounting for this family since the night Daniel died and had never once stopped long enough to let someone else carry any of it. "I think it means he's what he seems to be," Rosalie said. Clara chewed. "People aren't usually." "No, but some are." Another long pause. "Okay," Clara said, and took her apple out the back door. Rosalie stood at the stove and listened to her daughter's boots on the back step and thought, there it is. Not a dramatic moment, not an announcement, just an 8-year-old eating an apple and letting herself take one step out of the defensive crouch she'd been in for over a year. It was enough. It was more than enough. On the 4th day, May got up and came to the kitchen under her own power, which was her way of announcing she was done being ill. She set herself at the table with her doll and her carved horse and looked at Rosalie with an expression that said clearly, "This event is concluded. We will not speak of it further." Thomas said, "She looks better." "I can see that," Rosalie said. "She ate all her oatmeal." "I know. I made it." "I just wanted to report it," Thomas said, with the dignity of someone who took his reporting responsibilities seriously. Silas came in from the morning work and looked at May at the table and said, "Back," in the same tone he used for everything. Not gushing, not making a production. May looked at him. Then she picked up the carved horse and held it out toward him the way she had that first morning in the kitchen. Except this time she didn't just show it to him. She pushed it across the table, all the way to his side. Silas sat down. He looked at the horse in front of him. He picked it up with the same care he'd used the first time and turned it over in his hands, examining it the way you'd examine something you'd made and then lost track of. "You've been taking good care of him," he said. May watched him. "The ear's still crooked," he said. May nodded, once, as if this was acceptable, and she had decided it was acceptable, and that was the end of the matter. Silas set the horse back down in front of her. She took it back and placed it precisely beside the doll in its designated spot, and that was that. Thomas had been watching all of this with the expression of someone witnessing something he understood was important without being entirely sure why. He looked at Rosalie. She gave him a small nod that said, "Yes, you're right. It matters," and he nodded back and returned to his oatmeal. The morning after May came back to the kitchen, a wagon appeared at the end of the drive. Rosalie saw it from the garden, where she'd been checking on the lavender, which was holding, stubbornly, the way things that didn't need much tended to hold. She straightened up and shaded her eyes. It was not a neighbor she recognized, which meant it was either someone who'd come from town or someone who'd come from further. As it came closer, she made out two figures on the bench, a man driving, and beside him a woman of considerable size and considerable presence, who was sitting straight-backed with her hands in her lap, as though the wagon were a carriage and the road were a proper one. Silas appeared from the direction of the barn. He saw the wagon, stopped, and went very still for a moment in the way he went still when something caught him unprepared. Then he walked out to meet it. Rosalie stayed in this garden. She watched him reach the wagon and say something to the man driving, and then turn to the woman, and the woman said something back that required her to take his hat off. She reached up and took it right off his head with a decisive gesture, and the man driving laughed. Silas retrieved his hat. He turned and looked back toward the house and found Rosalie in the garden and held her gaze for a moment with an expression she couldn't read from the distance. Then he gestured once for her to come. She pulled off her garden gloves and went. The woman climbing down from the wagon was somewhere in her late 60s, built like someone who'd done physical work her whole life and had opinions about things that hadn't required modification in 30 years. She had gray hair pinned up with the efficiency of someone who didn't have time for elaborate arrangements, and dark eyes that went immediately and thoroughly to Rosalie in a way that was not unkind but was absolutely complete. "You're Rosalie," the woman said, not a question. "I am," Rosalie said. "Eleanor Granger." She held out her hand. Her grip was exactly what Rosalie had expected. Firm, dry, brief. "I'm his mother. I wrote him I was coming, and he didn't write back fast enough to stop me, so here I am." Rosalie looked at Silas. He had his hat back on, and his expression had the quality of a man who'd accepted a situation he had no control over. "She does this," he said. "I do," Eleanor agreed without remorse. "The man driving is my neighbor Robert, who owed me a favor. He'll be back in 3 days." She turned back to Rosalie. "Now, let me see these children." It was not a request. The next 2 hours were among the most exhausting and the most unexpectedly wonderful of Rosalie's time in Montana. Eleanor Granger moved through the house like someone taking inventory, not critically, but thoroughly. She looked at everything with the eyes of a woman who had run her own household for 40 years and knew exactly what the details meant. She said nothing about the state of the kitchen or the mending pile or the fact that there were small, muddy boot prints near the back door that Rosalie hadn't gotten to. She said one thing about the garden, which was lavender in the south corner was my idea. He won't admit it, but it was. And then moved on. Thomas she took to immediately and without ceremony. Within 20 minutes of her arrival, he was showing her the carved horse and the flat pink stone and explaining, at some length, the relative merits of various approaches to cattle management that he'd observed in the past several weeks. Eleanor listened to all of this with complete attention and asked 2 questions that Thomas clearly hadn't anticipated and that elevated her in his estimation to a significant degree. May she approached differently. She came and sat at the kitchen table across from her and didn't say a word, didn't reach toward her, didn't ask anything. She just sat. After approximately 5 minutes of this, May picked up the rag doll and set it on the table between them, which Eleanor looked at with appropriate seriousness and then said very quietly, "She's had a hard time." May looked at her. "So have you," Eleanor said. May picked the doll back up. Eleanor nodded once, accepting this, and got up and went to find Clara. Clara was in her room with the book she'd borrowed from Silas's shelf. She'd finished it and started it again, which meant she'd liked it, which she had not admitted to anyone. She looked up when Eleanor appeared in the doorway with the expression she kept in reserve for strangers, which was professionally unwelcoming. Eleanor looked at the book. Silas had that one. Read it 4 times. Clara glanced at the cover and back at Eleanor. It's good. It is. Eleanor leaned in the doorway with the ease of someone who took up space comfortably. You're Clara. Yes. Silas wrote me about you. Clara's eyes went slightly more alert. What did he say? He said you were 8 going on 40 and that you watched everything and didn't miss much. A pause. That's accurate, Clara said, with the precision of someone confirming a report. He also said you fixed your own shoe with a rock. It didn't work. No, but you tried first. Eleanor seemed to consider this settled. I like that. She pushed off the doorframe. Lunch is going to be a production. Come help me. Clara looked at the book, then at Eleanor. Then she put the book down and got up, which was either the most surprising thing Rosalie had seen all week or the most inevitable, depending on how you looked at it. Lunch was indeed a production. Eleanor had brought things in the wagon, specific things, chosen, and she took over the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who'd been cooking for large groups since before most people in the room were born. She put Clara to work on things that were actually useful, not busy work, which Clara recognized and responded to by working without complaint. She sent Thomas for water twice and told him both times exactly how full the bucket needed to be and why. She left May alone at the table and occasionally put things in front of her without comment, a biscuit, a piece of dried apple, which May examined and mostly ate. Rosalie she put to work beside her, and it was in this working side by side that the first real conversation between them happened. He was alone here too long, Eleanor said, not looking up from what she was doing. I know, Rosalie said. I tried to get him to write years ago. He said he wasn't ready. She was quiet for a moment. He was ready. He just didn't know what he was waiting for until it was specific enough to wait for. Rosalie considered this. He knew he wanted children specifically. He knew he wanted the kind of life that had children in it, Eleanor said. There's a difference. He didn't want to acquire children. He wanted to become part of something that was already going. She glanced sideways at Rosalie. He said that to you? Yes. He doesn't usually say things like that to people. I gathered. Eleanor was quiet for another moment. Then, how are you? Not the children. You. The directness of it caught Rosalie sideways, the way directness did when you weren't expecting it. She'd become accustomed to people asking about the children and leaving her out of the question, as though she were the medium through which the children were managed rather than a person herself. Scared, she said, because Eleanor seemed like the kind of woman who'd know if you gave her a lesser answer. Of what specifically? Of believing this is real and being wrong. Eleanor nodded, steady, unsurprised. That's reasonable. Most people would tell me not to be scared. Most people are managing their own discomfort when they say that, Eleanor said. What you're scared of makes sense. You've lost things. Loss changes how you hold new things. You hold them lighter because you've learned that squeezing doesn't keep them. She paused. But lighter isn't the same as not holding. Rosalie looked at her. He won't leave, Eleanor said. I want to be plain about that. I've known my son his whole life, and I know the shape of him, and this... She gestured with a spoon encompassing the house and the kitchen and whatever was outside the window. This is not something he'll walk away from. He doesn't make commitments he doesn't mean. He made one to you and these children when he sent that first letter. He's already in it. Rosalie looked at the pot she was stirring. I'm working on believing that, she said. Good, Eleanor said. Keep working. They didn't speak again for a few minutes. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who'd said the important things and didn't need to decorate them. Clara, from across the kitchen. Mrs. Granger, how much of this do I cut? All of it. And call me Eleanor. Mrs. Granger makes me feel like someone's about to read a will. Clara almost smiled. She covered it by looking back down at her cutting board, but Rosalie caught it, and from the slight shift in Eleanor's posture, Eleanor caught it too. Silas ate lunch at his own table with the contained expression of a man who'd been slightly ambushed by his mother's arrival and had decided the only dignified response was to pretend it was entirely normal. He answered Eleanor's questions about the ranch, with the efficiency of someone who knew that the questions were not really about the ranch, but that answering them straightforwardly was the correct strategy. He refilled Thomas's milk without being asked. He broke off a piece of his bread and put it on May's plate without comment, and May ate it without comment, which was their established language. At one point, Eleanor said, You look better than you did at Christmas. I haven't seen you since March, Silas said. I know what I said. He looked at her. She looked back. He returned to his lunch. Thomas said, When did you come in March? Before you all got here, Eleanor said. What was it like then? A slight pause. Eleanor glanced at Silas, who had the expression of someone who'd prefer this line of inquiry, dropped, but knew he wasn't going to get his preference. Quiet, Eleanor said. Really quiet? Thomas pressed. Like a stopped clock, Eleanor said. Thomas absorbed this. He looked at Silas. Is that true? It was quiet, Silas agreed, with the tone of someone not prepared to debate the degree. It's not quiet now, Thomas said. No, Silas said. Thomas seemed satisfied with this as a complete thought and went back to his lunch. Clara, who had been listening with the air of someone absorbing data, looked at Silas with an expression that had lost most of the professional distance she'd maintained for weeks and said nothing, which was a kind of speaking. Eleanor left on the third day, the same way she'd arrived, decisively, without ceremony, with Robert and the wagon and the straight-backed posture of a woman who moved through the world on her own terms. She embraced Silas in the way of mothers who'd learned not to make it too long because that would embarrass their sons, which still managed to embarrass him anyway. She shook Rosalie's hand and then, before releasing it, held it for a moment longer and said, Come see me and Helena. Bring all of them. We will, Rosalie said, and meant it. Eleanor looked at the children lined up on the step in the way children were when someone was leaving. Thomas holding his stone, May with her doll, Clara with her arms crossed, but her face open in a way she hadn't managed when Eleanor had arrived. You're good children, Eleanor said to them without sentimentality. All three of you. Keep being good. Thomas said, Yes, ma'am. May nodded. Clara said, Safe travels, which made Eleanor's eyes do something very briefly that she recovered from immediately. The wagon went down the drive and rounded the first bend in the road and was gone. Thomas said, I liked her. She liked you too, Silas said. How do you know? She asked you 2 questions about cattle. She only asks questions when she's interested. Thomas considered this. What if she was just being polite? She's not polite, Silas said. She's courteous. Those are different. Thomas turned this over. What's the difference? Polite is what you do when you don't mean it. Courteous is what you do when you respect someone enough to behave well. Thomas looked at him for a long moment with the expression he used when he was deciding whether something was true. Then he said, Okay, in the tone that meant he'd accepted it. The second week after May's fever was the one that rearranged everything. It started with something small, the way large shifts often did, and became something Rosalie had not been prepared for, which was the conversation she'd been circling for 2 months. She'd been at the table in the evening, the children in bed, the house in its nighttime quiet. Silas was in his chair with the accounts. This was their established pattern. Evenings at the table and the chair, doing different things, present without performing presence, which had become in its way the most comfortable part of her day. She'd been writing a letter, not to Margaret. She'd stopped writing to Margaret after she burned the last one, not in anger but in the understanding that there was no version of their correspondence that helped either of them. She was writing to a woman she'd been friends with in Kansas City, a woman named June, who had sent a simple, uncomplicated letter 3 weeks after they'd arrived that said, Tell me everything, and meant it. She'd been writing to June for 20 minutes when she said, without quite planning to, I've been waiting for you to change. Silas looked up from the accounts. Since we got here, she said, I've been waiting for you to become someone different, someone who'd... She stopped. Tried again. Someone who'd show me the version I should have been afraid of. He set down his pencil. And you haven't. She looked at the letter in front of her rather than at him. I've been watching for it the whole time. I thought if I watched carefully enough, I'd find it. Because everyone has it. Everyone has the part of them that... She stopped again. That what? He said. Not pushing, just asking. That reveals the cost, she said, of being with them, of staying. She put down her pen. Daniel was a good man. He was genuinely a good man. But even he'd get impatient in ways that landed on the children. He'd make decisions about our life and tell me afterward. He'd go quiet for days sometimes, and I never knew why, and he'd never explain it. She looked at her hands. I loved him completely, and I spent 12 years finding the parts of him that cost me. That's just what people are. I know that. Yes, Silas said. So where are yours? He was quiet for a moment. Not defensive quiet, thinking quiet. I get cold, he said finally. When things go bad. Not angry, cold. I shut down in a way that looks like I'm managing, but really I'm just gone somewhere, inside myself. Pete will tell you I've done it. I did it the night of the fever, after the doctor said she'd be all right. I came back out here and sat at this table for an hour, and I don't think I thought a single complete thought. He paused. I should have come back to check on you. I didn't. I went cold. She thought about that night, about sitting alone in the kitchen in the dead hours after the danger had passed, about the letter she'd thought about, but not written. She hadn't needed him to come back. But the knowing of it, the honesty of it, was its own thing. What else? She said. He looked at her. I'm not asking to catalog it, she said. I'm asking because I want to know what this actually is. Not the version where everything's fine. I hold things too long, he said. Grudges isn't the right word because I don't act on them. But I hold them. Something happens, someone treats me wrong, and I'll keep it for years without doing anything about it, and without letting it go either, just carrying it. He looked at the accounts on his knee. Gil knows this. He and I had a disagreement 4 years ago about how we were handling a section of the herd, and it went badly, and neither of us said the right things, and I've never fully let it go. He probably knows that. Have you ever told him? No. Why not? A long pause. Because I'd have to admit that I've been carrying it wrong for 4 years, and I don't like being wrong. That's human, she said. It's also not useful. No, she agreed. What else? He looked at her steadily. I don't need much, and sometimes I forget that other people do. I can go 2 days without needing to talk to someone and feel fine, and then remember that that's not comfortable for everyone. I probably did that to you those first 2 weeks and didn't notice. She had noticed. She'd interpreted it in those early weeks as indifference, before she'd understood the difference between his silence and emptiness. I thought you didn't want us here, she said. In the first week, sometimes. He looked at her with something that was not quite surprise but was close to it. No. I know that now. I didn't then. I should have been clearer. He rubbed the back of his neck, which was the only gesture he made when something was costing him something. I didn't know how to be clearer without being... I didn't want to push. You were already bracing for everything. I didn't want to add to it. So you went quiet. Yes. Which made me think you were pulling back. Yes. He said this with the expression of someone recognizing an error that had a clean, avoidable shape in retrospect. I'm sorry. You don't need to... I'm saying it because it's true. I should have done that differently. She was quiet for a moment. We're both doing this wrong in different ways, she said. Probably. She looked at the letter to June, half finished on the table. That's actually what I needed to hear. Not that everything's fine and there's nothing to navigate. That there are things to navigate and you know what they are. He looked at her for a long moment. What are yours? He said. She'd asked. She had to answer. I disappear when I'm afraid, she said. Not physically. I just close off. I stop letting anything in. I function completely. I do everything right. And no one can reach me. She picked up her pen and put it down again. You probably saw that during May's fever. A little. I do it with the children too. When things get bad, I get very competent and very sealed. Clara learned it from me. I see it in her and I know exactly where she got it. I didn't say it's not your fault. She was grateful he didn't say that. I also don't ask for things, she said, even when I need them. I was raised to manage. My mother she would have read your mother's arrival as an imposition, a failure to handle things independently. I've been fighting that voice my whole adult life and I still hear it. What does it say? That needing things is weakness, that asking is failure, that being sufficient unto yourself is the highest virtue. She looked at the lamp. And then I had 3 children and a husband, and I learned that's a lie. But I learned it too late to fully unlearn the reflex. He was quiet for a moment. You asked for the doctor, he said. I told you I needed one. That's different from asking. Is it? She thought about it. Maybe not. I think... He stopped. I think that night you asked for things you needed and let me provide them, and I think that was not small for you. It hadn't been. She hadn't realized he'd understood that. No, she said. It wasn't. They sat in the quiet for a moment. The stove was low and needed wood, and neither of them got up immediately to deal with it, which was its own kind of comfort, the ease of a place where not every small problem needed immediate management. Then Silas said, "I need to ask you something." Something in the way he said it shifted the air in the room. She looked at him. He was looking at his hands, which was unusual. He generally looked at what he was speaking to. "I need to ask you," he said slowly, "whether you want to stay." The directness of it hit her somewhere near the center of her chest. "This isn't," he looked up, "this isn't me asking you to decide how you feel about me. This is me asking whether you want this. The ranch, Montana, this specific life." He held her gaze. "Because you came here without choosing it the way you'd choose something if you had more options. You came because you needed to, and that's different from choosing. And I need to know whether, if you had the options back, if things were different, whether this is something you'd choose." She stared at him. She thought about Kansas City. She thought about the leaky roof and the taking in washing and Margaret's voice in her kitchen saying leavings. She thought about the train and the 3 days of watching Montana come up through the window. She thought about the carved horse with the chipped ear. She thought about the letter she'd burned. She thought about the lavender in the south corner, which was holding. She thought about her son's laugh in the barn. She thought about May saying okay without being asked. She thought about Clara eating an apple and saying quiet isn't always bad. She thought about Eleanor Granger holding her hand at the wagon and saying he won't leave. She thought about all the walls she'd built and all the careful watching and all the bracing and all the maybes she'd been allowing herself in place of the things she'd actually felt for weeks. "I would choose this," she said. "I do choose it." Something moved across his face that she hadn't seen before. Not relief exactly, but the release of something he'd been holding at the same careful distance she'd been holding her own things. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. Neither of them moved immediately. The stove needed wood, and the lamp needed trimming, and it was late enough that they both needed sleep. And none of these things happened for a moment because they were both just there, in the kitchen, on the other side of the conversation they'd been circling for 2 months. Then Silas got up and put wood in the stove. Rosalie finished the letter to June. She wrote, "I think I'm going to be all right. I think we all are. I'll tell you the rest when I have better words for it." She folded the letter. She looked at the lamp. She thought, "I chose this." Not because she had to, not because there was nowhere else, because she looked at the shape of it, imperfect and real and difficult in the ways that real things were difficult, and she wanted it. That was different from maybe. That was different from enough for now. That was something she didn't have a word for yet, but she thought she'd find one. The following week, Clara asked, in the middle of breakfast, and with the air of someone who'd been workshopping the phrasing for some time, "Are you and Silas going to get married?" Thomas looked up from his oatmeal. May looked up from her doll. Rosalie set down her coffee cup. Silas, at the stove, went very still. "That's," Rosalie started. "I'm asking because I want to know," Clara said. "Not because I'm against it. I'm just asking." Rosalie looked at the back of Silas's head, which told her nothing because he'd learned not to express things with the back of his head. "We haven't discussed it," she said. "You've been talking every night for 2 weeks," Clara said. "We've been talking about other things." "What other things?" "Clara." "I'm not trying to be rude," Clara said, and for once she genuinely wasn't. She was looking at her mother with the direct, careful attention she gave to things that mattered to her. "I just want to know what we're planning, so I can—" She stopped. "So I can plan." Silas turned from the stove. He set a plate down and then he pulled out his chair and sat down, which was unusual. He generally ate standing or sitting later, after the children. He sat down and looked at Clara. "What would help you plan?" he asked. Clara looked at him. "Knowing," she said. "Just knowing what's happening. Nobody told me when my dad was really sick. They kept saying he was going to be fine, and then he wasn't. And I could tell they were doing it to protect me, but it just meant I was surprised on top of everything else." She looked at the table. "I don't like surprises." "I know," Silas said. "So if something's happening, I want to know." "Fair enough." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'd like to marry your mother. I haven't asked her yet because—" He glanced at Rosalie. "Because I didn't know until recently that she was choosing to stay. Now I know. So the asking is something I was going to do. He looked back at Clara. But I wanted her to be ready, not to feel like he searched for the word like it was the next thing on a list. Clara was looking at him with the full attention expression she used for things she was deciding about. Are you going to ask her? She said. Yes. When? Clara, Rosalie said. It's a reasonable question, Clara said. It is, Silas said. He looked at Rosalie now, directly, and there was something in his face that was very clear and very simple and had no performance in it. When she's ready. Rosalie looked at him. The kitchen was very quiet. Thomas had stopped eating. May was looking between them with her wide, serious eyes. Rosalie thought about, I would choose this. She thought about how she'd said it and what it had felt like to say it, and how it had felt true in a way that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with just being accurate. I'm ready, she said. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Thomas said, in a voice that was trying very hard to be normal and not quite managing it, does that mean? Yes, Rosalie said. That means. Thomas let out a sound that was not quite a word and turned red and looked at his oatmeal. Clara sat very still. She was looking at the table and her jaw was doing the thing it did when she was working through something, the slight movement of a person thinking in real time. Then she looked up at Silas and said, You're not going to be our dad. No, he said. I know that. You can't be. I know. So what are you going to be? He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Someone who's here, he said. Someone you can come to if you need to. Someone who does what I can for you and doesn't pretend to be something I'm not. He paused. I can't replace him. I don't want to. What I can do is be another person in your corner. Clara looked at him for a long time. Okay, she said finally. Not I accept this or that's good enough or any of the other versions. Just okay. The word she used when she'd decided something was true and had filed it where it belonged. She picked up her spoon and went back to her oatmeal. May, who had been watching all of this with her customary focused attention, looked at her doll, then at the carved horse, then at Silas. Then she reached across the table and put one small hand briefly on top of his. Just for a moment. She pulled it back immediately and returned to her doll with the air of someone who'd made a statement and considered it closed. But she'd made it. Silas sat with his hand on the table where she'd touched it and did not move for a moment, and his face did the thing it had done the night of the fever. Complicated and real and not composed, the thing he let happen when he thought no one was tracking him closely. Rosalie was tracking him closely. She looked at his face, and she looked at her daughter's small hand on the doll's worn fabric, and she looked at the carved horse with its chipped ear standing in its designated spot, and she thought about leavings, about Margaret's voice in the kitchen, about what she'd believed they were when they'd boarded that train. She thought, we were never leavings. We were just waiting for the right place to land. She thought it, and this time she let herself keep it. Outside the kitchen window, the Montana morning was doing what it always did, going wide and blue and enormous, indifferent and beautiful. The lavender was growing in the south corner of the garden. The horses were in the pasture. Thomas's pink-striped stone was on the windowsill where he'd put it 2 weeks ago, so the light could come through it in the afternoon. And in a kitchen in Mill Haven, Montana, 5 people were eating breakfast, imperfectly and together, which was not a small thing. It was not a small thing at all. Silas asked her on a Tuesday evening, which Rosalie would later think was right. She'd arrived on a Tuesday. It made a kind of sense that this would happen on one too. He didn't make a production of it. There were no flowers, no arrangement, no moment staged for effect. They were in the garden. She'd been checking the lavender, which had put out its first real growth in the 2 weeks since May's fever, small and determined and faintly purple. And he'd come out from the barn and stood at the edge of the garden bed and watched her for a moment and then said, Rosalie. She straightened up. He had his hat in his hands, the same way he'd held it at the station. She noticed that immediately. The hat off, held at his side. The same gesture he'd made when he walked toward 4 strangers on a platform in April and decided they were worth the walking toward. I know I said when you were ready, he said, and I know that might still be. Ask me, she said. He looked at her. Will you marry me? She had dirt on her hands and her hair was coming loose from its pin on the left side, and the lavender behind her was barely 3 inches tall, and the question was asked without anything ornamental around it, just the plain fact of it, which was exactly right. Yes, she said. He let out a breath that told her he'd been holding it, which she hadn't expected from him, and which was the most human thing she'd ever seen him do. She almost laughed. She reached up and tucked the loose hair back behind her ear and said, "Did you think I was going to say no?" "I don't take things for granted," he said. "I told you I'd choose this." Saying you'd choose something and being asked directly are different. She thought about that. He wasn't wrong. There was something about a direct question that made the answer land differently, made it real in a way that a stated intention didn't quite achieve. "You're right," she said. He put his hat back on. She went back to the lavender for a moment, pressing the soil around one of the plants that had listed slightly in the last rain, and then she stood up and they walked back to the house together. And that was the proposal and the acceptance, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly the shape of them. She told the children at breakfast the next morning, directly, the way Clara needed things, without ceremony, the way Thomas needed things, and with the rag doll and carved horse both visible on the table, which was the closest she could come to telling May in a language May would absorb. Thomas said, "I know," with the satisfied tone of someone confirming a thing they'd predicted. Clara said, "Okay," and then looked at her oatmeal for a moment and then said, "When?" which was her way of accepting things, by moving immediately to logistics. May looked at the carved horse on the table. Then she looked at her rag doll. Then she looked at Rosalie and at Silas, who was at the stove, and she did something she hadn't done before. She picked up the carved horse and walked it across the table to stand next to Rosalie's coffee cup. Not near her own doll, where it usually lived. Next to Rosalie. Then she picked her doll up and walked it across to stand next to the horse. All four of them looked at what she'd arranged. Thomas said, very quietly, "She put them together." Silas looked at the two small objects standing side by side on the table, and something moved across his face that he didn't try to manage or contain. "Yeah," he said. "She did." May picked up her spoon and ate her oatmeal. The horse and the doll stayed where she'd put them for the rest of breakfast, and nobody moved them. The wedding was in September, which gave the lavender time to fully bloom. Rosalie had not planned to use the lavender. It was Eleanor who suggested it, in one of the letters she and Rosalie had begun exchanging after her visit. Letters that had a quality Rosalie hadn't expected, direct and warm and occasionally funny, the kind of correspondence between women who didn't have time to be indirect. Eleanor wrote, "Use what you've grown. There's no better thing to carry than something you put in the ground yourself." So she did. The ceremony was small. The Reverend Marsh from Mill Haven came out, a practical man in his 50s who understood that people on ranches had limited time and said what needed to be said without decoration. Pete and Gil stood in the yard in their best shirts, which were versions of their work shirts with less obvious mending. Dr. Whitmore came, which surprised Rosalie until she thought about a man who'd ridden out at midnight for a child he'd never met, and realized he was exactly the kind of person who'd show up for the wedding. Eleanor was there. She'd written 2 months earlier, "I'll be there. Don't argue." Rosalie had not argued. She'd written back, "Bring Robert if he wants to come." Robert came. He and Gil spent most of the morning discussing fence maintenance with the ease of men who'd found common ground. Thomas wore his good shirt and polished his boots with the focused energy of someone who understood the gravity of occasions and intended to honor it. He carried the flat pink-striped stone in his pocket, which Rosalie saw him touch once, briefly, before the ceremony started. Not nervously, more like checking in with something. She understood that. Clara wore a dress she'd hemmed herself, which Rosalie had let her do after one conversation about the importance of doing things yourself and one silent acknowledgement between them that Clara needed to bring something she'd made to this particular day. The hem was slightly uneven on the left side. Clara knew it. She wore it anyway. May wore a white dress that Eleanor had brought from Helena, packed carefully at the bottom of her bag. It had eyelet at the collar. May submitted to it with the stoic acceptance she gave to clothing she found acceptable, and spent the morning before the ceremony arranging the rag doll and the carved horse in the windowsill of her room, in some configuration only she fully understood, then came and stood where she was needed without being told. Rosalie wore a dress she had made from fabric she'd chosen herself in Mill Haven the previous week. Dark blue, practical cut, with nothing about it that would require special handling. She carried the lavender from the south corner, bundled and tied with a piece of twine because she didn't have ribbon and had decided that was fine. She stood next to Silas in the yard of the ranch, with the September light going gold, and the cattle somewhere distant in the pasture, and the hired hands in their good shirts, and Eleanor watching from the edge of the gathering with the expression of a woman who'd waited a long time for this and intended to absorb every second of it. The Reverend said what he said. Silas said his part in the same voice he used for everything, level, unhurried, no performance in it, which was exactly what she needed because she was already holding enough. When he got to "for as long as we both shall live," something in his voice changed by 1 degree. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone who didn't know him would catch, but she was 6 inches away from him and she caught it. She heard what was underneath it, the weight of a man who'd been alone a long time saying the word "we" and meaning it all the way down. She said her part. Her voice was steady. She'd always been able to make her voice steady when she needed it to be. But her hands weren't entirely, and he was holding them, and he felt it, and his grip got slightly firmer without comment. When it was done, the Reverend shook both their hands and said something brief and appropriate, and Clara said loudly, with the tone of someone who had been waiting for the procedural portion to conclude, "Can we eat now?" Pete laughed. Thomas said, "Clara," in the reproachful tone he'd recently acquired for managing his older sister's social instincts. Eleanor made a sound that was approximately a laugh, controlled at the last moment into something more dignified. Silas looked at Rosalie. She looked at him. "We can eat," she said. The meal was not elegant. It was the kind of food you made for a lot of people with a working kitchen and 2 days of preparation. Things that kept, things that fed, things that could be eaten standing up if needed. Eleanor had taken over the kitchen the day before with the same decisive efficiency she'd shown on her first visit, and Rosalie had worked beside her, and the two of them had produced something that was not a wedding feast but was genuinely good food made with care, which was better. Thomas ate more than seemed structurally possible for a person his size. Clara ate with one eye on the adults and one on the food, tracking everything with her customary dual awareness. May ate carefully and deliberately and accepted a second piece of cake from Eleanor without being asked twice, which Eleanor noted with visible satisfaction. At some point in the late afternoon, when the food was mostly gone, and the Reverend had left, and Robert and Gil were deep into a conversation about a fence project that had clearly taken on a life of its own, Rosalie found herself standing at the edge of the garden with the lavender bundle in her hand, the ceremony long concluded, the day going orange and long shadowed. She heard footsteps behind her and didn't turn around because she knew them. Silas stood beside her. They looked at the lavender together, at what had come from the cuttings on the back step, from the hard soil of the south corner, from the weeks of careful tending. It wasn't spectacular. It was modest, the way first-year lavender was modest. More potential than presence, more promise than arrival. But it was there. It had held. "It'll be better next year," he said. "I know," she said. "And the year after that." She looked at him sideways. I was looking at this garden with the expression he wore for things he'd already decided about. Not hoping, just seeing forward. "The year after that," she said. He looked at her. Almost smiled. The almost smile she'd been watching for 6 months, the one he gave carefully. She thought, "I'm going to be watching that almost smile for the rest of my life." The thought arrived without dread, without the bracing she'd been doing since April. It arrived the way things arrived when they were simply true. What she did not know, standing in the garden on her wedding day with lavender in her hand and Montana going golden around her, was how the next years would shape them. She couldn't know it. That was the nature of choosing. You chose without the knowledge of what you were choosing into, which was terrifying and the only honest way to do it. What she would learn was this. Real life did not cooperate with the idea that difficulty was a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be lived alongside. The first winter was harder than she'd expected, not because of any one thing, but because of the accumulation of things. The cold that was different from anything she'd known in Kansas City, deeper and more total. The particular isolation of a ranch when the roads were impassable, the way the children's energy had nowhere to go during the weeks when they couldn't be outside. Thomas got a chest cold that lasted 3 weeks and scared her more than she let anyone see. Clara and Silas had their first real argument, not about anything important, about a book she'd left in the barn and that had gotten wet. And it wasn't about the book at all, but about the fact that she'd been inside her own head for a week and hadn't told anyone, and the book was just the place where it finally came out. Silas handled it imperfectly, the way he'd warned her he sometimes did. Went cold for a day, came back the next morning and apologized directly, which was right, but the cold day had mattered and they both knew it. Rosalie let herself be angry about the cold day. She told him so. He listened and didn't defend it, and they came out the other side of the conversation, understanding each other better than before, which was how it worked when both people were willing to stay in the room. She found out in February that she was pregnant. She sat with this information alone for 2 days, which was not the right choice, and she knew it but needed the time anyway. The fear that came with it was not simple. It was layered, old fear underneath new. The memory of how Daniel had died before their youngest was old enough to know him, threaded through everything. She did not want this child to grow up the way her first three had grown up, with a hole in the center of things. She told Silas on a Thursday evening in the kitchen, in the same kitchen where she'd told him she chose this, and where he'd asked her, and where May had walked the carved horse across the table to stand next to Rosalie's coffee cup. He went still in the way he went still for things that hit him somewhere deep. Then he said, "Are you all right?" Not "that's wonderful," or "I can't believe it," or any of the first response things. "Are you all right?" Because he knew her well enough by February to know that this was complicated for her and that the complication deserved to be the first thing addressed. She looked at him. "I'm scared," she said. "I know. I'm also—" She stopped. "I don't have a word for the other thing." "You don't need one right now," he said. He came around the table and sat next to her rather than across from her, which he didn't usually do. He generally gave her space, had learned to read when she needed the table between them as a kind of breathing room. He sat next to her and didn't say anything else, and she put her head down on her arms on the table and breathed for a minute, which was not composed and was not the capable version of herself, and which she had needed to do for 2 days. He put his hand on her back. Just his hand. Still. She came back up after a minute and wiped her face and said, "Clara's going to have opinions." He said, "She has opinions about everything. This will be no different." She almost laughed. Almost, and then all the way, because she was tired and it was February, and there was a new life coming that she hadn't planned for, and the almost laugh was the only honest response. Clara did have opinions. She received the news with the expression of someone doing complex calculations at speed and then said, "How is that going to work with the room arrangements?" Which was the most Clara possible response, and which meant, underneath the logistics, that she was accepting it. Thomas said, "Is it going to be a boy or a girl?" And when told they didn't know yet, said, "I'd like a brother. I'm surrounded by women." Clara said, "There's also Silas." Thomas said, "He doesn't count the same." Silas said, "Thank you, Thomas." Thomas said, "I meant it nicely." May, told as carefully and directly as they could manage for a not quite 4-year-old, looked at Rosalie's stomach with the focused attention she gave to everything significant, and then went and retrieved the carved horse from its place in the windowsill and put it in Rosalie's lap. She left it there and went back to her doll. Rosalie held the carved horse and looked at the chipped ear and thought about the man who'd made it before he knew who was coming, and she held it with both hands for a long moment before she put it back. The baby was born in October, 1 year after the wedding, which was also when the lavender was at its best. Fuller than the first year, properly established, the south corner of the garden finally doing what the soil had always had the capacity to do. They named him James Owen Granger. Silas had not asked for this. Rosalie had come to him with it. She'd been thinking about the two brothers since the night he'd told her about them in the kitchen while the Montana sky was going light, and she'd been carrying it quietly for months, and she brought it to him one morning before the children were up and said, "I'd like to name him James Owen, if it's all right with you." She'd expected the careful stillness. She'd expected him to need a moment. She had not expected his face to do what it did. Not the composed version, not the managed version, but the one underneath, the one he showed her now more than he showed anyone, the one that was simply what he felt without any arrangement. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Yeah," he said, in a voice that wasn't entirely steady. Yeah." She put her hand on his arm. He put his hand over hers. They stayed like that for a moment in the morning quiet of a house where 4 children were still asleep, and the lavender was outside doing what lavender did. And she thought about 2 boys named James and Owen who had not gotten to grow up, and about a man who had carried them quietly for 20 years, and about the particular way love worked, how it reached backward as well as forward, how it held things that were gone as well as things that were coming. James Owen Granger arrived in the early morning with the efficiency of a child who'd apparently decided this was happening on his own schedule, which the doctor said was normal, and which Rosalie, having done this 3 times before, handled with the competence of a person who knew exactly what she was doing even when it was hard. Silas stayed. He did not go cold. He stayed in the room, and he was present the way she'd needed him to be for the most difficult hours of it. And when James Owen arrived and announced his arrival in the way of babies, he held him with the careful inexperience of a man who'd never done this before, and the particular focus of a man who understood what he was holding. Thomas appeared in the doorway approximately 40 seconds after the noise started, which meant he'd been awake and waiting. "Is that him?" he said. "That's him," Rosalie said. Thomas looked at the baby, at Silas holding the baby, at the expression on Silas's face. "He looks upset," Thomas said. "Babies usually are when they arrive," Dr. Whitmore said from somewhere he was tidying up. "Does it stop?" "Eventually." Thomas considered this. "Okay," he said. Clara came in behind him, pretending she hadn't been right there the whole time, and looked at the baby with the assessment she gave to new things. She was 9 now, had turned 9 in July, and the 9-year-old version of Clara was not drastically different from the 8-year-old version, except that she'd stopped bracing as much. Not entirely. She still watched, she still cataloged, but the watching was less defensive and more interested. Like she'd moved from monitoring a situation to being curious about it. She looked at the baby and said, "James Owen." "James Owen," Rosalie confirmed. Clara looked at Silas. He looked at her over the baby's head. Something passed between them, the kind of thing that doesn't require words between people who've been paying attention to each other for a year and a half. "It's a good name," Clara said. "Yeah," Silas said, "it is." May came in last, because May always came in last. She was 4 now, and still quiet, and still carried the rag doll everywhere, though the rag doll had acquired a small companion, a piece of fabric she'd taken from Rosalie's sewing basket and wound into a rough shape that was not clearly anything but that May treated as a doll, which meant it was one. She came to the edge of the bed and looked at the baby with her full, unblinking attention. Then she reached out and touched the baby's hand with one finger. The baby's hand closed around it, the involuntary grip of newborns, which didn't mean anything, but which felt like it meant everything. May looked at her finger held by the baby's hand with the expression she'd worn when she'd introduced the rag doll and the carved horse, when she'd walked the horse across the table to stand by Rosalie's coffee cup, when she'd put her hand briefly on top of Silas's and pulled it back. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. James Owen Granger changed the house in the way babies changed houses, completely and without negotiation. He was not a peaceful baby. He had opinions about sleep and expressed them at volume. He had a particular cry for hunger and a different one for everything else. And it took 2 weeks to reliably tell them apart, and those 2 weeks were a special kind of exhaustion that Rosalie had forgotten was possible to feel. Thomas was enormously helpful in a 5-year-old way, which meant his help was approximately 40% actually useful and 60% requiring gentle redirection, but he was earnest about it in a way that counted for something. He took the job of reporting James Owen's status to anyone who came within range very seriously. He's sleeping. He just ate. He's upset again. That's a different cry. That means something else. He had apparently conducted his own research. Clara, who had announced that she was not going to be the one who changed things, quietly, without admitting it, in the way Clara did everything that cost her something. She started coming to sit near Rosalie during the nighttime feedings without being asked, not saying much, just there. Rosalie did not comment on this. She let Clara do what Clara needed to do in the way Clara needed to do it. Silas learned. That was the thing she watched and could not entirely prepare herself for. Watching a man learn to be a father in real time, with all the wrong moves and the corrections and the moments of getting it right and not knowing he'd gotten it right. He was not a natural the way some people were supposed to be naturals. He was deliberate about it, careful in the way he was careful about things he didn't know yet. He asked Rosalie questions when the children were out of earshot, not because he was hiding the not knowing, but because he understood that the children needed him to be competent in front of them, and he wanted to do the learning somewhere that didn't cost them. She told him that was the right instinct, but that it was also okay to let them see him figure things out sometimes. That it was actually useful for Thomas and Clara to see an adult not know something and then learn it, because they were both going to spend their lives not knowing things and then having to learn them. He considered this seriously, the way he considered everything. "Okay," he said. The next morning, when James Owen was crying and Silas was trying to figure out the specific kind of crying, and couldn't, he said, "Thomas, help me out. Which one is this?" Thomas came and listened with professional focus. That's the other one, he said. Not hungry. Something else. What's the something else? I don't know. We're still figuring that one out. Silas looked at Thomas. Okay, let's figure it out. They stood together over the baby, two people with different amounts of information and the same amount of uncertainty, which was more honest and more useful than any performance of competence would have been. Clara, watching from the doorway, did not say anything, but she came in. What Rosalie had not fully understood, before Montana, before Silas, before the lavender in the south corner, and the carved horse with the chipped ear, was that love was not a thing you fell into. That was the wrong word for it. Falling implied passivity, implied that you had no say in the matter, that it happened to you while you were standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. What she understood now was that love was a thing you built, not in the grand sense, not in the way of speeches and gestures, in the way of daily choices, to stay in the room, to ask the question, to apologize when the cold day mattered, to teach a boy which cry meant what, to carry lavender that you grew yourself on a September morning in a Montana yard, to keep choosing every morning the imperfect real thing over the perfect imagined thing. She was not a different person than she'd been in Kansas City. She was still scared sometimes and sealed sometimes and prone to disappearing when things got difficult. She still heard Margaret's voice in her head occasionally, though less often now, and it had less authority. She still had mornings where she stood in the garden and looked at everything she'd planted and had to remind herself that it was hers, that she'd made it, that it wasn't going to be taken. Silas still went cold sometimes. He still held things too long. He and Gil had finally had the conversation about the 4-year-old disagreement. Not perfectly, not a complete resolution, but they'd had it, which Silas reported to Rosalie afterward with the expression of a man who'd done something he'd been putting off and found it less awful than expected. It wasn't that hard, he said, slightly accusing, as though she'd promised it would be and then it hadn't been. I never said it would be hard, she said. I said it would be better after. Same thing. It's not the same thing. The anticipation was Silas. Yes. Just admit I was right. He looked at the ceiling. You were right. Thank you. I still think the anticipation counts for something. She let him have that. The thing about choosing, she'd come to understand, was that you didn't choose once. You didn't stand in a garden in September and say, I choose this, and then have it settled. You chose it every morning when you got up and made breakfast and navigated the complicated geography of 5 people and then 6 people in a house together. You chose it every time something went wrong and you stayed instead of going. You chose it every time you let yourself be known instead of keeping the foot near the door. May spoke in full sentences by the time James Owen was 6 months old. Not suddenly, not dramatically. In the way things happened with May, gradually, and then all at once. She'd been adding words for months, one here and one there, small words that she offered like the deliberate gestures she offered everything. And then one morning she came to the kitchen and said to Silas, with complete and grammatical clarity, "The horse needs water." He turned from the stove. She looked at him with her level eyes. "Midnight," she said. He was looking at the trough, and it's low. Silas looked at her for a moment. "Good eye," he said. "I'll get it." "I already got Gil," May said. "He's doing it." She sat down and picked up her fork. Thomas was staring at her. Clara was staring at her. Rosalie had her hand over her mouth. May looked around at all of them. "What?" she said. "You—" Thomas started. "I talk," May said, with the mild impatience of someone whose patience for being treated as remarkable was limited. "I've been talking." "Not like that," Thomas said. "I talk when I have something to say," May said. She poured herself a small glass of milk with the focused precision she brought to all physical tasks. Most of the time, people are saying things that have already been said. There was a silence. Then Clara said, to no one in particular, "She's been saving it." "I've been listening," May said. "That's different." Rosalie looked at her daughter. This child who'd gone quiet after her father died and found her way back not through anyone's intervention, but through the patient work of a household that had given her time and space and a carved horse, and a man who'd said, "He's still a good horse," about a chipped ear and meant it. And she did not try to make her voice steady. She just looked. May looked back at her. "Don't cry, Mama," May said. "I'm fine." "I know you are," Rosalie said. "Then don't cry." "I'm not crying. Your face is doing the thing." "I know what my face is doing." May considered her. Okay, she said, and went back to her breakfast. Silas, who had been very still at the stove, turned back to whatever he'd been making. Rosalie saw his shoulders do the thing they did when he was containing something. She understood that. Thomas said, into the residual silence, "Can I have more bread?" "There's bread," Silas said, without turning around. "That's not a yes. It's an observation that the bread exists and you are capable of reaching it." Thomas reached for the bread. Clara said quietly to Rosalie, "She was always going to be okay. I knew it." Rosalie looked at her oldest child. "When did you know?" she said. "When she put the horse next to your coffee cup," Clara said. "That day at breakfast. That was when I knew." Rosalie thought about it. The horse walked across the table, placed with deliberate care. May's way of saying, "These things belong together now." "You were right," Rosalie said. Clara nodded, accepting this as her due. 2 autumns after the wedding, Rosalie got a letter from Kansas City that was not from Margaret. It was from June, her friend, the one she wrote to, the one who'd said, "Tell me everything." And June wrote that she'd run into Margaret at the market, and that Margaret had said, and June was quoting directly because she thought Rosalie would want to know, "I heard it worked out for her out there." That was it. That was the entirety of what Margaret had said. Rosalie read the letter twice and then put it on the table and looked at it. She thought about leavings. She thought about the kitchen in Kansas City and Clara in the doorway and May holding the rag doll too tight. She thought about how much that word had cost them, how long she'd carried it, how it had sat in her chest alongside the wanting and the fear for months before she'd been able to put it down. She did not feel angry. That surprised her. She'd expected anger, or the residue of it, something that came up when the origin of a wound was named. What she felt was something more like distance. The distance of a person who had traveled a long way from a particular place and could now see it clearly for what it was. A woman who said leavings out loud in a kitchen where children could hear was a woman in a great deal of pain of her own. Rosalie didn't know what Margaret's pain was. She'd never been curious enough to ask, which was its own kind of answer. She wrote back to June. Tell her it did. Tell her we're well. That was all. It didn't need more than that. She went back to the garden. The lavender in the south corner was 3 years old now. It had become what Silas had said it would become. Properly established, properly itself. The south corner no longer hard and resistant, but turned and tended and producing something. She cut some in the morning sometimes and brought it inside and put it in a jar on the kitchen table, which May had decided she approved of. She stood in the garden on an ordinary morning in the 3rd autumn with the light coming sideways across the ranch, and James Owen on her hip. He was walking now, but was in a phase of preferring to be carried, which she understood more than she'd admitted to anyone because she knew it wouldn't last. And she looked at the lavender and the garden and the house and the barn and the fence line going as far as she could see. Thomas was with Silas somewhere in the east pasture, which was where Thomas spent most of his time now when he wasn't doing his lessons. He was 7 and had developed opinions about cattle management that were occasionally correct, which Silas had started deferring to when they were correct, which Thomas had noticed, and which had changed the shape of him in some way she was still watching. Clara was inside, probably reading. She'd gotten through most of Silas's shelf, and he'd started ordering books from the store in Mill Haven, which arrived in batches every few weeks, and which Clara went through with the focused appetite of someone who'd found the thing they'd been starving for. She was 9 and already talking about what came after. Not with the braced, defensive planning of someone escaping, but with the open curiosity of someone who had a safe enough place that she could afford to look forward. May was probably with the horses. She had a particular relationship with Midnight that Silas said he'd never seen a child develop with a horse. Not the excited attachment of Thomas, but something quieter, more mutual, the relationship of 2 beings who'd recognized something in each other. Midnight didn't let most people near him without effort. He walked to the fence for May. James Owen patted Rosalie's cheek with a damp hand, which was his current method of demanding attention. "I see you," she said. He patted her cheek again. "I'm looking right at you." He made a sound of either agreement or complaint. At 12 months, it was still sometimes hard to tell with him, which she mentioned to Silas regularly, and which Silas said was clearly something James Owen had gotten from her side, which was not accurate, but which she let stand because it was funny. She thought about the woman who had stood at a kitchen table in Kansas City and read a letter written in careful, unhurried handwriting and read it 5 times and still didn't let herself hope. She thought about what that woman had known and what she hadn't. What she'd been right to be afraid of and what she'd been wrong to be afraid of. What fear had protected her and what it had just made harder. She thought, I couldn't have gotten here without all of it. The fear, the walls, the watching, the careful foot near the door. All of it had been part of how she'd arrived here intact enough to choose. If she'd been less defended, she might have chosen wrong, or too fast, or from the wrong place. The caution had served her. She just hadn't needed it forever. That was the thing about protection. You needed it until you didn't. The skill was in knowing when to set it down. And you didn't always know in the moment. Sometimes you only knew in retrospect, looking back from the place where you'd arrived, understanding that at some point the armor had quietly become the obstacle. She had set it down. Not all at once. Not without grief for what it had cost her to wear it for so long. But she'd set it down, here, in this garden, in this house, with this man and these children who were hers in all the ways that mattered. She was not finished. She understood that now in a way she hadn't when she was younger. That you were never finished. That the work of being in a life with people was ongoing and would remain ongoing until it stopped. And that this was not a failure, but simply the nature of real things. Real things required maintenance. Real things developed problems and required attention, and sometimes broke and needed repair. The ragdoll's seams split and got resewn. The lavender needed cutting back in the spring, or it got woody. The fence line needed checking. People needed to be apologized to. Conversations needed to be had. The carved horse still had its chipped ear. Nobody had fixed it. Nobody was going to. James Owen put his forehead down on her shoulder with the comfortable heaviness of a child who'd decided this was where he was staying, and that was final. She held him and looked at the lavender. Somewhere in the east pasture, she heard Thomas's voice go up in the particular register it reached when he'd just seen something that excited him. She couldn't hear the words, just the pitch of it, the bright urgency of a 7-year-old who'd found something worth reporting. She heard Silas's lower voice answering. She thought, that is my son, and that is my husband, and they are in a field in Montana, and they are all right. She thought, we are all right. Not perfectly. Not without the ongoing work of it, without the conversations still to be had, and the mistakes still to be made, and the winters still to come. Not without May's continuing silence on the days when she went back inside herself. Not without Clara's occasional return to the defensive crouch. Not without Silas's cold days and her own sealed ones. Not without the particular ache of Daniel's absence that she did not expect to ever go away entirely and had made her peace with not expecting. But all right, genuinely, solidly, in the deep sense of the word that meant something built rather than something wished for. She'd spent a long time believing that we was a thing she'd lost when Daniel died. That the version of her life that had a we in it was finished, and what remained was the managing and the surviving and the making do. She'd believed it so thoroughly that she'd read a letter from Montana 5 times and still not let herself hope. She knew now that she'd been wrong about the finished part. Not because everything had worked out. Things didn't always work out. And pretending otherwise was the particular dishonesty of people who'd gotten lucky and wanted credit for wisdom. She'd been wrong about the finished part because she'd confused the end of one thing with the end of things. The end of Daniel was the end of that specific life, that specific love, that specific shape of family. It was not the end of her capacity for any of it. She still didn't think of herself as lucky. Luck was passive, something that happened to you. What had happened here had required her to make a choice under conditions of fear and uncertainty and very limited information, and to keep making it every morning in the small and ongoing ways that choices were actually made. That wasn't luck. That was something harder and more durable. That was what she'd give Clara if she could give her anything worth keeping. Not it will work out, or you'll find your person, or any of the soft reassurances that made the giver feel better without actually preparing the receiver for anything. She'd give her this. It will cost you something to want things. It will cost you something to stay. Do it anyway. Not because it will definitely be fine, but because the alternative is a very small life, and you are not a small person. Clara was 9. She had time to learn it from watching. Rosalie stood in the garden in the 3rd Montana autumn, with her son's weight on her shoulder and the lavender blooming in the south corner and the sound of her family moving through the world around her. The rag doll and the carved horse were inside, on May's windowsill, where they'd lived for 3 years. One original, one made by hand for a child who hadn't arrived yet. Both imperfect, both held carefully, both still here. She looked at the lavender. She thought, grow. And it did.